Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we open the pages of one of the most enchanting tales ever told. But before we begin, if these quiet stories bring you peace, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. I'd truly love to know where you're listening from and what hour of the night finds you here. Our little circle now stretches across oceans, bound by stories and calm. So dim the lights, let the air grow still, and let your mind wander gently with me into tonight's story. The Naughty Boy. A long time ago, there lived an old poet, a thoroughly kind old poet. As he was sitting one evening in his room, a dreadful storm arose without, and the rain streamed down from heaven. But the old poet sat warm and comfortable in his chimney-corner, where the fire blazed and the roasting apple hissed. "Those who have not a roof over their heads will be wetted to the skin," said the good old poet. "Oh, let me in, I am cold, and I'm so wet," exclaimed suddenly a child that stood crying at the door and knocking for admittance, while the rain poured down and the wind made all the windows rattle. "Poor thing," said the old poet as he went to open the door. There stood a little boy, quite naked, and the water ran down from his long golden hair. He trembled with cold, and had he not come into a warm room, he would most certainly have perished in the frightful tempest. "Poor child," said the old poet as he took the boy by the hand. Come in, and I will soon restore thee. Thou shalt have wine and roasted apples, for thou art verily a charming child." And the boy was so really. His eyes were like two bright stars, and although the water trickled down his hair, it waved in beautiful curls. He looked exactly like a little angel, but he was so pale, and his whole body trembled with cold. He had a nice little bow in his hand, but it was quite spoiled by the rain, and the tints of his many-colored arrows ran one into the other. The old poet seated himself beside his hearth and took the little fellow on his lap. He squeezed the water out of his dripping hair, warmed his hands between his own, and boiled for him some sweet wine. Then the boy recovered. His cheeks again grew rosy. He jumped down from the lap where he was sitting and danced round the kind old poet. "You are a merry fellow," said the old man. "What's your name?" "My name is Cupid," answered the boy. "Don't you know me? There lies my bow. It shoots well, I can assure you. Look, the weather is now clearing up, and the moon is shining clear again through the window." "Why, your bow is quite spoiled," said the old poet. "That were sad indeed," said the boy, and he took the bow in his hand and examined it on every side. "Oh, it is dry again, and is not hurt at all. The string is quite tight. I will try it directly." And he bent his bow, took aim, and shot an arrow at the old poet, right into his heart. "You see now that my bow was not spoiled," said he, laughing, and away he ran. The naughty boy, to shoot the old poet in that way, he who had taken him into his warm room, who had treated him so kindly, and who had given him warm wine and the very best apples. The poor poet lay on the earth and wept, for the arrow had really flown into his heart. "Fie," said he, "how naughty a boy Cupid is. I will tell all children about him, that they may take care and not play with him, for he will only cause them sorrow and many a heartache." And all good children to whom he related this story took great heed of this naughty Cupid, but he made fools of them still, for he is astonishingly cunning. When the university students come from the lectures, he runs beside them in a black coat and with a book under his arm. It is quite impossible for them to know him, and they walk along with him arm in arm, as if he too were a student like themselves. And then, unperceived, he thrusts an arrow to their bosom. When the young maidens come from being examined by the clergyman, or go to church to be confirmed, there he is again, close behind them. Yes, he is forever following people. At the play, he sits in the great chandelier and burns in bright flames, so that people think it is really a flame, but they soon discover it is something else. He roves about in the garden of the palace and upon the ramparts. Yes, once he even shot your father and mother right in the heart. Ask them only, and you will hear what they'll tell you. Oh, he is a naughty boy, that Cupid. You must never have anything to do with him. He is forever running after everybody. Only think, he shot an arrow once at your old grandmother. But that is a long time ago, and it is all past now. However, a thing of that sort she never forgets. Fie, naughty Cupid. But now you know him, and you know too how ill-behaved he is. The Daisy. Now listen closely. Along the winding country road, where the dust of carriages settled softly on the hedgerows, there stood a small, honest farmhouse. Perhaps you have passed by it yourself and noticed the little garden that smiled in front of it, a patch of green framed by neat wooden palings painted in cheerful colors. Behind the fence bloomed proud tulips, stately peonies, and velvet roses, each stretching toward the sun as if competing for its golden favor. And yet, just beyond that well-tended border, beside a narrow ditch where the water whispered among the reeds, there grew a single daisy. So small was it that few eyes ever found it, so humble that even the breeze forgot to boast about it. But the daisy did not complain. The sun shone upon its white petals just as warmly as upon the grand flowers in the garden, and the little flower, content with its place in the world, lifted its face toward the light with gratitude. That morning, the daisy opened fully for the first time. Its white petals unfolded like a tiny crown around its golden heart, and it felt so happy that it almost trembled. Above it, high in the clear blue air, the lark sang, its song bright, free, and filled with the joy of living. The little daisy listened with all its heart. It understood none of the words, yet somehow knew their meaning. That life, however small, was a gift worth singing about. It was only Monday, an ordinary day. The children were at school, the farmer at his work, and the world went about its business without noticing the little daisy. But to the daisy, it was a festival day. While others studied their lessons in books, it learned its own from the sun and sky, from the whispering grass and the kindly earth beneath. How good God is, thought the little flower. He has given me warmth, light, and song. I can see and I can hear. What more riches could I desire? In the neighboring garden, the tulips and peonies stood in all their splendor. But the greater their color, the greater their pride. The tulips held their heads stiffly upright, like candles in a row, and whispered about their noble lineage. The peonies swelled their blossoms till they could hardly breathe, wishing to be thought grander still. The daisy looked toward them with admiration, not envy. How beautiful they are, it thought. The lark will surely visit them next, but how lucky I am to stand near enough to see such magnificence. At that very moment, the lark swooped down through the sunlight, not to the tulips or peonies, but to the little daisy in the grass. "Tweet!" sang the bird joyfully, hopping round and round the tiny flower. "What a lovely spot of earth is this! How soft the grass, and what a sweet little blossom with a golden heart and a silver dress. The daisy's heart nearly burst with delight. It could not speak, but every petal quivered with happiness. The bird kissed it lightly with its beak, sang one more bright song, and soared away again into the blue. The daisy watched until it was only a speck in the sky, and for a long while after, it could do nothing but dream. When at last it glanced toward the garden, it saw the proud flowers looking stiffer than ever. The tulips burned red with anger, the peonies swelled till they nearly burst. The daisy pitied them. They do not know, it thought softly, that joy is not in being admired, but in being loved. Later that day, a girl came into the garden with a sharp knife. She went from flower to flower, cutting the tulips and peonies for her bouquet. "Oh dear," sighed the daisy, trembling a little. "How dreadful to be so beautiful that one is cut down." When the girl carried the flowers away, the daisy felt a deep sense of gratitude to be small and unnoticed. As the sun set, it folded its petals, whispering a little prayer of thanks before falling asleep. But the next morning brought sorrow. When the daisy opened again to greet the sun, it heard a sad, thin song, so different from the bright one it had heard before. The lark had been caught and shut in a cage near the farmhouse window. It sang of freedom lost, of flying high above the meadows, of green fields and clouds that kissed the mountain peaks. The daisy listened, aching with pity. How it longed to comfort its friend, yet what could a small flower do? Soon 2 boys came out of the house. One carried a knife like the girl's. "Here's a nice piece of turf for the lark," said one, and he cut a square of grass around the daisy so that it sat in the center. "Shall we pluck it off?" asked the other. The daisy trembled, fearing death. "No, let it stay. It looks so pretty," said the first. And so the daisy went into the cage, still rooted in its small patch of earth. The lark fluttered against the bars, crying for the open sky. The daisy stood silently, offering only the faint fragrance of its petals as comfort. "I have no water," gasped the poor bird after a while. "They have forgotten me. My throat burns, and the air is heavy. Must I die without seeing the sun again?" It pressed its beak to the turf to cool itself, and saw the daisy. "Ah, little flower," whispered the lark, "you too will fade here. You are all they've given me in place of the world. Each petal of yours shall be to me a star, each blade of grass a tree. But still, they only remind me of what I've lost." The daisy tried with all its being to send comfort through its scent, soft and sweet. It could not move, could not speak, but it gave all it had. The lark felt the gentle fragrance and paused for a moment in peace. Then the day passed, and no one came with water. The bird's song grew fainter, its wings drooped, and at last, with one small tweet, it bowed its head toward the daisy and died. All night the little flower stood awake. It could not close its petals as before. It bent low, heavy with grief. When morning came, the boys found the lark dead. They wept bitterly, dug a grave, and buried the bird in a red box, laying fine flowers over it. "We must honor it like a king," they said. And yet, while it lived, they had forgotten it. As for the daisy, no one thought of it. They threw the square of turf out onto the dusty road. There it lay, roots drying in the sun, its white petals speckled with dust. Yet even as it faded, the little daisy thought not of itself, but of the lark, whose song had once filled the sky. And that is how the smallest of God's creatures can carry the greatest love. The buckwheat. After a summer thunderstorm, when the clouds have rolled away and the air smells of wet soil and crushed grass, you may see a strange sight in the countryside. A field of buckwheat lies blackened, its leaves curled as if fire had passed over them. The peasants shake their heads and say softly, "The lightning struck here." But the sparrows know another story. They heard it from an old willow tree that still stands by the edge of that very field. A tree so ancient that moss carpets its roots and ivy twines about its split trunk. The bark is rough like the wrinkles of an old face, and its branches droop low, brushing the earth like green hair grown too long. Yet though bent by years, the willow still whispers when the wind moves through its leaves. Around it stretch broad fields of grain, barley and rye, and the golden oats that, when ripe, shimmer like tiny yellow birds perching together on invisible boughs. Each ear of corn bows its heavy head as if in silent prayer, grateful for the sun and rain that nourish it. Across from the willow once grew a proud field of buckwheat. It stood stiff and straight, its stalks pointing upward as if challenging the sky itself. "Look at me," said the buckwheat. "My blossoms are whiter than apple flowers and finer than all the grains around me. Why should I bow my head like them? The earth should admire me." The old willow merely swayed a little, saying nothing, though its leaves trembled with a sigh. The buckwheat laughed mockingly. "You are old and foolish," it said. "Grass grows out of your cracked bark. What do you know of beauty or pride?" Then one afternoon the sky began to darken. A wind came running over the plain, bending the rye and barley till they almost touched the ground. The poppies closed their scarlet petals. Even the tall sunflowers turned their faces away. Thunder rumbled like a giant beating on a drum, and the first flashes of lightning leapt from cloud to cloud. "Bend your heads as we do," whispered the corn. "Fold your petals," murmured the flowers. "The storm is coming." But the buckwheat tossed its pale blossoms and cried, "I will not bend. Let the storm come. I will face it upright." The willow's branches rustled anxiously. "Listen to me, foolish one," said the old tree. "Do not look at the lightning when the cloud bursts. Even men close their eyes before its glory. In that instant heaven opens, and whoever dares to gaze may lose his sight. Bow low and wait until it passes." "Inferior creatures may tremble," said the buckwheat, "but I will look straight into heaven itself." The storm broke. The wind shrieked, and the rain fell in silver sheets. Lightning poured from the clouds like rivers of fire, and the thunder cracked the air. In that blinding moment, the proud buckwheat lifted its face, and the sky answered with a single flash so fierce that the whole world seemed ablaze. When at last the tempest rolled away, the fields glistened under a clear and gentle light. Drops of water clung to every ear of grain like jewels, and the flowers unfolded again, refreshed and fragrant. The oats and barley raised their bowed heads with gratitude. But the buckwheat, the buckwheat lay black and shriveled on the ground, its blossoms turned to soot. The old willow stood silent, shaking in the wind. From its green leaves fell great heavy drops. Not rain now, but tears. The sparrows fluttered close and asked, "Why do you weep, old willow? The storm has passed, the sun shines again, and all the world rejoices. The air smells sweet, and the sky is blue. Why do you still cry?" Then the willow murmured, "I weep for the proud buckwheat that would not bend. It looked into the lightning's eye and perished. It would not learn the wisdom of humility, nor listen when warned, and now it is gone, blackened by its own defiance. The sparrows chirped softly among the trembling leaves. "Tell us this tale again," they said, "that we may remember." And the willow answered, "Tell it to all who would stand too proudly against the storm." That is the story the sparrows told me one quiet evening when I asked for a tale from the fields, how pride once gazed upon heaven and was blinded by its own vanity. The bell. In the narrow streets of a large town, people often heard in the evening, when the sun was setting and his last rays gave a golden tint to the chimney pots, a strange noise which resembled the sound of a church bell. It only lasted an instant, for it was lost in the continual roar of traffic and hum of voices which rose from the town. "The evening bell is ringing," people used to say. "The sun is setting." Those who walked outside the town, where the houses were less crowded and interspersed by gardens and little fields, saw the evening sky much better and heard the sound of the bell much more clearly. It seemed as though the sound came from a church, deep in the calm, fragrant wood, and thither people looked with devout feelings. A considerable time elapsed. One said to the other, "I really wonder if there is a church out in the wood. The bell has indeed a strange, sweet sound. Shall we go there and see what the cause of it is?" The rich drove, the poor walked, but the way seemed to them extraordinarily long, and when they arrived at a number of willow trees, on the border of the wood they sat down, looked up into the great branches, and thought they were now really in the wood. A confectioner from the town also came out and put up a stall there. Then came another confectioner who hung a bell over his stall, which was covered with pitch to protect it from the rain. But the clapper was wanting. When people came home, they used to say that it had been very romantic, and that really means something else than merely taking tea. 3 persons declared that they had gone as far as the end of the wood. They had always heard the strange sound, but there it seemed to them as if it came from the town. One of them wrote verses about the bell, and said that it was like the voice of a mother speaking to an intelligent and beloved child. No tune, he said, was sweeter than the sound of the bell. The emperor of the country heard of it, and declared that he who would really find out where the sound came from should receive the title of bell ringer to the world, even if there was no bell at all. Now many went out into the wood for the sake of this splendid birth, but only one of them came back with some sort of explanation. None of them had gone far enough, nor had he, and yet he said that the sound of the bell came from a large owl in a hollow tree. It was a wisdom owl, which continually knocked its head against the tree, but he was unable to say with certainty whether its head or the hollow trunk of the tree was the cause of the noise. He was appointed bell ringer to the world, and wrote every year a short dissertation on the owl. But by this means people did not become any wiser than they had been before. It was just confirmation day. The clergyman had delivered a beautiful and touching sermon. The candidates were deeply moved by it. It was indeed a very important day for them. They were all at once transformed from mere children to grown-up people. The childish soul was to fly over, as it were, into a more reasonable being. The sun shone most brightly, and the sound of the great unknown bell was heard more distinctly than ever. They had a mind to go thither, all except 3. One of them wished to go home and try on her ball dress, for this very dress and the ball were the cause of her being confirmed this time, Otherwise, she would not have been allowed to go. The second, a poor boy, had borrowed a coat and a pair of boots from the son of his landlord to be confirmed in, and he had to return them at a certain time. The third said that he never went into strange places if his parents were not with him. He had always been a good child and wished to remain so even after being confirmed, and they ought not to tease him for this. They, however, did it all the same. These three, therefore, did not go. The others went on. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the confirmed children sang too, holding each other by the hand, for they had no position yet, and they were all equal in the eyes of God. Two of the smallest soon became tired and returned to the town. Two little girls sat down and made garlands of flowers. They, therefore, did not go on. When the others arrived at the willow trees, where the confectioner had put up his stall, they said, "Now we are out here. The bell does not in reality exist. It is only something that people imagine." Then suddenly the sound of the bell was heard so beautifully and solemnly from the wood that 4 or 5 made up their minds to go still further on. The wood was very thickly grown. It was difficult to advance. Wood lilies and anemones grew almost too high. Flowering convolvuli and brambles were hanging like garlands from tree to tree, while the nightingales were singing and the sunbeams played. That was very beautiful, but the way was unfit for the girls. They would have torn their dresses. Large rocks, covered with moss of various hues, were lying about. The fresh spring water rippled forth with a peculiar sound. "I don't think that can be the bell," said one of the confirmed children, and then he lay down and listened. "We must try to find out if it is." And there he remained, and let the others walk on. They came to a hut built of the bark of trees and branches. A large crab-apple tree spread its branches over it, as if it intended to pour all its fruit on the roof, upon which roses were blooming. The long boughs covered the gable, where a little bell was hanging. Was this the one they had heard? All agreed that it must be so, except one who said that the bell was too small and too thin to be heard at such a distance, and that it had quite a different sound to that which had so touched men's hearts. He who spoke was a king's son, and therefore the others said that such a one always wishes to be cleverer than other people. Therefore they let him go alone. And as he walked on, the solitude of the wood produced a feeling of reverence in his breast. But still, he heard the little bell about which the others rejoiced, and sometimes, when the wind blew in that direction, he could hear the sounds from the confectioner's stall, where the others were singing at tea. But the deep sounds of the bell were much stronger. Soon it seemed to him as if an organ played an accompaniment. The sound came from the left, from the side where the heart is. Now something rustled among the bushes, and a little boy stood before the king's son, in wooden shoes and such a short jacket that the sleeves did not reach to his wrists. They knew each other. The boy was the one who had not been able to go with them because he had to take the coat and boots back to his landlord's son. That he had done, and had started again in his wooden shoes and old clothes, for the sound of the bell was too enticing. He felt he must go on. "We might go together," said the king's son. But the poor boy with the wooden shoes was quite ashamed. He pulled at the short sleeves of his jacket and said that he was afraid he could not walk so fast. Besides, he was of opinion that the bell ought to be sought at the right, for there was all that was grand and magnificent. "Then we shall not meet," said the king's son, nodding to the poor boy, who went into the deepest part of the wood, where the thorns tore his shabby clothes and scratched his hands, face, and feet until they bled. The king's son also received several good scratches, but the sun was shining on his way, and it is he whom we will now follow, for he was a quick fellow. "I will and must find the bell," he said, "if I have to go to the end of the world." Ugly monkeys sat high in the branches and clenched their teeth. "Shall we beat him?" they said. "Shall we thrash him? He is a king's son." But he walked on undaunted, deeper and deeper into the wood, where the most wonderful flowers were growing. There were standing white star lilies with blood-red stamens, sky-blue tulips shining when the wind moved them, apple trees covered with apples, like large glittering soap bubbles. Only think how resplendent these trees were in the sunshine. All around were beautiful green meadows, where hart and hind played in the grass. There grew magnificent oaks and beech trees, and if the bark was split of any of them, long blades of grass grew out of the clefts. There were also large, smooth lakes in the wood, on which the swans were swimming about and flapping their wings. The king's son often stood still and listened. Sometimes he thought that the sound of the bell rose up to him out of one of these deep lakes, but soon he found that this was a mistake, and that the bell was ringing still farther in the wood. Then the sun set. The clouds were as red as fire. It became quiet in the wood. He sank down on his knees, sang an evening hymn, and said, "I shall never find what I am looking for. Now the sun is setting, and the dark night is approaching. Yet I may perhaps see the round sun once more, before he disappears beneath the horizon. I will climb up these rocks. They are as high as the highest trees." And then, taking hold of the creepers and roots, he climbed up on the wet stones, where water snakes were wriggling, and the toads, as it were, barked at him. He reached the top before the sun, seen from such a height, had quite set. Oh, what a splendor! The sea, the great majestic sea, which was rolling its long waves against the shore, stretched out before him, and the sun was standing like a large bright altar, and there where sea and heaven met, all melted together in the most glowing colors. The wood was singing, and his heart too. The whole of nature was one large holy church, in which the trees and hovering clouds formed the pillars, the flowers and grass, the woven velvet carpet, and heaven itself was the great cupola. Up there the flame color vanished as soon as the sun disappeared, but millions of stars were lighted. Diamond lamps were shining, and the king's son stretched his arms out towards heaven, towards the sea, and towards the wood. Then suddenly the poor boy with the short-sleeved jacket and the wooden shoes appeared. He had arrived just as quickly on the road he had chosen, and they ran towards each other and took one another's hand in the great cathedral of nature and poesy, and above them sounded the invisible holy bell. Happy spirits surrounded them, singing hallelujahs and rejoicing. The old house. A very old house stood once in a street with several that were quite new and clean. The date of its erection had been carved on one of the beams and surrounded by scrolls formed of tulips and hop tendrils. By this date, it could be seen that the old house was nearly 300 years old. Verses, too, were written over the windows in old-fashioned letters, and grotesque faces, curiously carved, grinned at you from under the cornices. One story projected a long way over the other, and under the roof ran a leaden gutter with a dragon's head at the end. The rain was intended to pour out at the dragon's mouth, but it ran out of his body instead, for there was a hole in the gutter. The other houses in the street were new and well built, with large window panes and smooth walls. Anyone could see they had nothing to do with the old house. Perhaps they thought, "How long will that heap of rubbish remain here to be a disgrace to the whole street? The parapet projects so far forward that no one can see out of our windows what is going on in that direction. The stairs are as broad as the staircase of a castle, and as steep as if they led to a church tower. The iron railing looks like the gate of a cemetery, and there are brass knobs upon it. It is really too ridiculous." Opposite to the old house were more nice new houses, which had just the same opinion as their neighbors. At the window of one of them sat a little boy with fresh, rosy cheeks and clear, sparkling eyes, who was very fond of the old house, in sunshine or in moonlight. He would sit and look at the wall from which the plaster had, in some places, fallen off, and fancy all sorts of scenes which had been in former times. How the street must have looked when the houses had all gable roofs, open staircases, and gutters with dragons at the spout. He could even see soldiers walking about with halberds. Certainly it was a very good house to look at for amusement. An old man lived in it, who wore knee breeches, a coat with large brass buttons, and a wig, which anyone could see was a real wig. Every morning an old man came to clean the rooms, and to wait upon him. Otherwise, the old man in the knee breeches would have been quite alone in the house. Sometimes he came to one of the windows and looked out. Then the little boy nodded to him, and the old man nodded back again, till they became acquainted and were friends, although they had never spoken to each other. But that was of no consequence. The little boy one day heard his parents say, "The old man opposite is very well off, but is terribly lonely." The next Sunday morning, the little boy wrapped something in a piece of paper and took it to the door of the old house, and said to the attendant who waited upon the old man, "Will you please give this from me to the gentleman who lives here? I have 2 tin soldiers, and this is one of them, and he shall have it, because I know he is terribly lonely." And the old attendant nodded and looked very pleased, and then he carried the tin soldier into the house. Afterwards he was sent over to ask the little boy if he would not like to pay a visit himself. His parents gave him permission, and so it was that he gained admission to the old house. The brassy knobs on the railings shone more brightly than ever, as if they had been polished on account of his visit. And on the door were carved trumpeters standing in tulips, and it seemed as if they were blowing with all their might. Their cheeks were so puffed out. "Tanta-ra-ra, the little boy is coming. Tanta-ra-ra, the little boy is coming." Then the door opened. All round the hall hung old portraits of knights in armor and ladies in silk gowns, and the armor rattled and the silk dresses rustled. Then came a staircase, which went up a long way, and then came down a little way, and led to a balcony, which was in a very ruinous state. There were large holes and long cracks, out of which grew grass and leaves. Indeed, the whole balcony, the courtyard, and the walls were so overgrown with green that they looked like a garden. In the balcony stood flower pots, on which were heads having asses' ears, but the flowers in them grew just as they pleased. In one pot, pinks were growing all over the sides. At least the green leaves were shooting forth stalk and stem, and saying as plainly as they could speak, "The air has fanned me, the sun has kissed me, and I am promised a little flower for next Sunday, really for next Sunday." Then they entered a room in which the walls were covered with leather, and the leather had golden flowers stamped upon it. Gilding will fade in damp weather. To endure, there is nothing like leather, said the walls. Chairs handsomely carved, with elbows on each side, and with very high backs, stood in the room, and as they creaked, they seemed to say, "Sit down. Oh dear, how I am creaking. I shall certainly have the gout like the old cupboard. Gout in my back. Ugh." And then the little boy entered the room where the old man sat. "Thank you for the tin soldier, my little friend," said the old man. "And thank you also for coming to see me." "Thanks, thanks." Or, "Creak, creak," said all the furniture. There was so much that the pieces of furniture stood in each other's way to get a sight of the little boy. On the wall near the center of the room hung the picture of a beautiful lady, young and gay, dressed in the fashion of the olden times, with powdered hair and a full, stiff skirt. She said neither thanks nor creak, but she looked down upon the little boy with her mild eyes. And then he said to the old man, "Where did you get that picture?" "From the shop opposite," he replied. "Many portraits hang there that none seem to trouble themselves about. The persons they represent have been dead and buried long since. But I knew this lady many years ago, and she has been dead nearly half a century." Under a glass beneath the picture hung a nosegay of withered flowers, which were no doubt half a century old too, at least they appeared so. And the pendulum of the old clock went to and fro, and the hands turned round, and as time passed on, everything in the room grew older, but no one seemed to notice it. "They say at home," said the little boy, "that you are very lonely." "Oh," replied the old man, "I have pleasant thoughts of all that has passed, recalled by memory, and now you are come to visit me, and that is very pleasant." Then he took from the bookcase a book full of pictures representing long processions of wonderful coaches, such as are never seen at the present time. Soldiers like the knave of clubs, and citizens with waving banners. The tailors had a flag with a pair of scissors supported by 2 lions, and on the shoemaker's flag there were not boots, but an eagle with 2 heads. For the shoemakers must have everything arranged so that they can say, "This is a pair." What a picture book it was! And then the old man went into another room to fetch apples and nuts. It was very pleasant, certainly, to be in that old house. "I cannot endure it," said the tin soldier, who stood on a shelf. "It is so lonely and dull here. I have been accustomed to live in a family, and I cannot get used to this life. I cannot bear it. The whole day is long enough, but the evening is longer. It is not here like it was in your house, opposite, when your father and mother talked so cheerfully together, while you and all the dear children made such a delightful noise. No, it is all lonely in the old man's house. Do you think he gets any kisses? Do you think he ever has friendly looks or a Christmas tree? He will have nothing now but the grave. Oh, I cannot bear it." "You must not look only on the sorrowful side," said the little boy. "I think everything in this house is beautiful, and all the old pleasant thoughts come back here to pay visits." "Ah, but I never see any, and I don't know them," said the tin soldier, "and I cannot bear it." "You must bear it," said the little boy. Then the old man came back with a pleasant face, and brought with him beautiful preserved fruits, as well as apples and nuts, and the little boy thought no more of the tin soldier. How happy and delighted the little boy was! And after he returned home, and while days and weeks passed, A great deal of nodding took place from one house to the other, and then the little boy went to pay another visit. The carved trumpeters blew, "Tanta-ra-ra." There is the little boy, "Tanta-ra-ra." The swords and armor on the old knight's pictures rattled, the silk dresses rustled, the leather repeated its rhyme, and the old chairs had the gout in their backs and cried, "Creak." It was all exactly like the first time, for in that house, one day and 1 hour were just like another. "I cannot bear it any longer," said the tin soldier. "I have wept tears of tin. It is so melancholy here. Let me go to the wars and lose an arm or a leg. That would be some change. I cannot bear it. Now I know what it is to have visits from one's old recollections, and all they bring with them. I have had visits from mine, and you may believe me, it is not altogether pleasant. I was very nearly jumping from the shelf. I saw you all in your house opposite, as if you were really present. It was Sunday morning, and you children stood round the table, singing the hymn that you sing every morning. You were standing quietly, with your hands folded, and your father and mother. You were standing quietly, with your hands folded, and your father and mother were looking just as serious when the door opened and your little sister Maria, who is not 2 years old, was brought into the room. You know she always dances when she hears music and singing of any sort, so she began to dance immediately, although she ought not to have done so. But she could not get into the right time because the tune was so slow. So she stood first on one leg and then on the other and bent her head very low. But it would not suit the music. You all stood looking very grave, although it was very difficult to do so. But I laughed so to myself that I fell down from the table and got a bruise, which is there still. I know it was not right to laugh. So, all this, and everything else that I have seen, keeps running in my head, and these must be the old recollections that bring so many thoughts with them. Tell me whether you still sing on Sundays, and tell me about your little sister Maria, and how my old comrade is, the other tin soldier. Ah, really, he must be very happy. I cannot endure this life. You are given away, said the little boy. You must stay. Don't you see that? Then the old man came in with a box containing many curious things to show him. Rouge pots, scent boxes, and old cards, so large and so richly gilded that none are ever seen like them in these days. And there were smaller boxes to look at, and the piano was opened, and inside the lid were painted landscapes. But when the old man played, the piano sounded quite out of tune. Then he looked at the picture he had bought at the broker's, and his eyes sparkled brightly as he nodded at it and said, "Ah, she could sing that tune. I will go to the wars, I will go to the wars," cried the tin soldier as loud as he could, and threw himself down on the floor. Where could he have fallen? The old man searched, and the little boy searched, but he was gone, and could not be found. "I shall find him again," said the old man, but he did not find him. The boards of the floor were open and full of holes. The tin soldier had fallen through a crack between the boards, and lay there now in an open grave. The day went by, and the little boy returned home. The week passed, and many more weeks. It was winter, and the windows were quite frozen, so the little boy was obliged to breathe on the panes and rub a hole to peep through at the old house. Snowdrifts were lying in all the scrolls and on the inscriptions, and the steps were covered with snow, as if no one were at home. And indeed, nobody was home, for the old man was dead. In the evening, a hearse stopped at the door, and the old man in his coffin was placed in it. He was to be taken to the country to be buried there in his own grave. So they carried him away. No one followed him, for all his friends were dead. And the little boy kissed his hand to the coffin as the hearse moved away with it. A few days after, there was an auction at the old house, and from his window the little boy saw the people carrying away the pictures of old knights and ladies, the flower pots with the long ears, the old chairs, and the cupboards. Some were taken one way, some another. Her portrait, which had been bought at the picture dealer's, went back again to his shop, and there it remained, for no one seemed to know her or to care for the old picture. In the spring, they began to pull the house itself down. People called it complete rubbish. From the street could be seen the room in which the walls were covered with leather, ragged and torn, and the green in the balcony hung straggling over the beams. They pulled it down quickly, for it looked ready to fall, and at last it was cleared away altogether. "What a good riddance," said the neighbors' houses. Very shortly, a fine new house was built farther back from the road. It had lofty windows and smooth walls, but in front, on the spot where the old house really stood, a little garden was planted, and wild vines grew up over the neighboring walls. In front of the garden were large iron railings and a great gate, which looked very stately. People used to stop and peep through the railings. The sparrows assembled in dozens upon the wild vines, and chattered all together as loud as they could, but not about the old house. None of them could remember it, for many years had passed by, so many indeed that the little boy was now a man, and a really good man too, and his parents were very proud of him. He was just married, and had come, with his young wife, to reside in the new house with the garden in front of it. And now he stood there by her side, while she planted a field flower that she thought very pretty. She was planting it herself with her little hands, and pressing down the earth with her fingers. "Oh dear, what was that?" she exclaimed, as something pricked her. Out of the soft earth something was sticking up. It was, only think, it was really the tin soldier, the very same which had been lost up in the old man's room, and had been hidden among old wood and rubbish for a long time, till it sunk into the earth, where it must have been for many years. And the young wife wiped the soldier, first with a green leaf, and then with her fine pocket handkerchief, that smelt of such beautiful perfume. And the tin soldier felt as if he was recovering from a fainting fit. "Let me see him," said the young man. And then he smiled and shook his head and said, "It can scarcely be the same, but it reminds me of something that happened to one of my tin soldiers when I was a little boy." And then he told his wife about the old house and the old man, and of the tin soldier which he had sent across because he thought the old man was lonely. And he related the story so clearly that tears came into the eyes of the young wife for the old house and the old man. "It is very likely that this is really the same soldier," said she, "and I will take care of him, and always remember what you have told me. But some day you must show me the old man's grave." "I don't know where it is," he replied. "No one knows. All his friends are dead, no one took care of him, and I was only a little boy." "Oh, how dreadfully lonely he must have been," said she. "Yes, terribly lonely," cried the tin soldier. "Still, it is delightful not to be forgotten." "Delightful indeed," cried a voice quite near to them. No one but the tin soldier saw that it came from a rag of the leather which hung in tatters. It had lost all its gilding and looked like wet earth, but it had an opinion, and it spoke it thus: "Gilding will fade in damp weather. To endure, there is nothing like leather." But the tin soldier did not believe any such thing. A cheerful temper. From my father I received the best inheritance, namely a good temper. And who was my father? That has nothing to do with the good temper, but I will say he was lively, good-looking, round, and fat. He was both in appearance and character a complete contradiction to his profession. And pray, what was his profession and his standing in respectable society? Well, perhaps, if in the beginning of a book these were written and printed, many, when they read it, would lay the book down and say, "It seems to me a very miserable title. I don't like things of this sort." And yet my father was not a skin dresser nor an executioner. On the contrary, his employment placed him at the head of the grandest people of the town, and it was his place by right. He had to precede the bishop and even the princes of the blood. He always went first. He was a hearse driver. There, now, the truth is out. And I will own that when people saw my father perched up in front of the omnibus of death, dressed in his long, wide black cloak, and his black-edged, three-cornered hat on his head, and then glanced at his round, jocund face, round as the sun, they could not think much of sorrow or the grave. That face said, "It is nothing. It will all end better than people think." So I have inherited from him not only my good temper, but a habit of going often to the churchyard, which is good, when done in a proper humor. And then also I take in the intelligencer, just as he used to do. I am not very young. I have neither wife nor children, nor a library. But as I said, I read the intelligencer, which is enough for me. It is to me a delightful paper, and so it was to my father. It is of great use, for it contains all that a man requires to know, the names of the preachers at the church, and the new books which are published, where houses, servants, clothes, and provisions may be obtained. And then what a number of subscriptions to charities, and what innocent verses! Persons seeking interviews and engagements, all so plainly and naturally stated. Certainly, a man who takes in the intelligencer may live merrily and be buried contentedly, and by the end of his life will have such a capital stock of paper that he can lie on a soft bed of it, unless he prefers wood shavings for his resting place. The newspaper and the churchyard were always exciting objects to me. My walks to the latter were like bathing places to my good humor. Everyone can read the newspaper for himself, but come with me to the churchyard while the sun shines and the trees are green, and let us wander among the graves. Each of them is like a closed book, with the back uppermost, on which we can read the title of what the book contains, but nothing more. I had a great deal of information from my father, and I have noticed a great deal myself. I keep it in my diary, in which I write for my own use and pleasure, a history of all who lie here, and a few more beside. Now we are in the churchyard, here behind the white iron railings. Once a rose tree grew. It is gone now, but a little bit of evergreen. From a neighboring grave stretches out its green tendrils and makes some appearance. There rests a very unhappy man, and yet while he lived he might be said to occupy a very good position. He had enough to live upon and something to spare, but owing to his refined tastes, the least thing in the world annoyed him. If he went to a theater of an evening, instead of enjoying himself, He would be quite annoyed if the machinist had put too strong a light into one side of the moon, or if the representations of the sky hung over the scenes when they ought to have hung behind them, or if a palm tree was introduced into a scene representing the zoological gardens of Berlin, or a cactus in a view of Tyrol, or a beech tree in the north of Norway. As if these things were of any consequence. Why did he not leave them alone? Who would trouble themselves about such trifles, especially at a comedy where everyone is expected to be amused? Then sometimes the public applauded too much, or too little, to please him. "They are like wet wood," he would say, looking round to see what sort of people were present. "This evening, nothing fires them." Then he would vex and fret himself because they did not laugh at the right time, or because they laughed in the wrong places. And so he fretted and worried himself till at last the unhappy man fretted himself into the grave. Here rests a happy man, that is to say, a man of high birth and position, which was very lucky for him, otherwise he would have been scarcely worth notice. It is beautiful to observe how wisely nature orders these things. He walked about in a coat embroidered all over, and in the drawing rooms of society looked just like one of those rich pearl-embroidered bell-pulls which are only made for show. And behind them always hangs a good, thick cord for use. This man also had a stout, useful substitute behind him, who did duty for him and performed all his dirty work. And there are still, even now, these serviceable cords behind other embroidered bell ropes. It is all so wisely arranged that a man may well be in a good humor. Here rests. It makes one feel mournful to think of him. But here rests a man who, during 67 years, was never remembered to have said a good thing. He lived only in the hope of having a good idea. At last he felt convinced, in his own mind, that he really had one, and was so delighted that he positively died of joy at the thought of having at last caught an idea. Nobody got anything by it. Indeed, no one even heard what the good thing was. Now I can imagine that this same idea may prevent him from resting quietly in his grave. For suppose that to produce a good effect, it is necessary to bring out his new idea at breakfast, and that he can only make his appearance on earth at midnight, as ghosts are believed generally to do. Why then this good idea would not suit the hour, and the man would have to carry it down again with him into the grave. That must be a troubled grave. The woman who lies here was so remarkably stingy that during her life she would get up in the night and mew that her neighbors might think she kept a cat. What a miser she was! Here rests a young lady of a good family who would always make her voice heard in society, and when she sang "Mi manca la voce," it was the only true thing she ever said in her life. Here lies a maiden of another description. She was engaged to be married, but her story is one of everyday life. We will leave her to rest in the grave. Here rests a widow, who with music in her tongue carried gall in her heart. She used to go round among the families near and search out their faults, upon which she preyed with all the envy and malice of her nature. This is a family grave. The members of this family held so firmly together in their opinions that they would believe in no other. If the newspapers, or even the whole world, said of a certain subject, "It is so-and-so," and a little schoolboy declared he had learned quite differently, they would take his assertion as the only true one, because he belonged to the family. And it is well known that if the yard cock belonging to this family happened to crow at midnight, they would declare it was morning, although the watchmen and all the clocks in the town were proclaiming the hour of 12 at night. The great poet Goethe concludes his Faust with the words, "May be continued." So might our wanderings in the churchyard be continued. I come here often, and if any of my friends, or those who are not my friends, are too much for me, I go out and choose a plot of ground in which to bury him or her. Then I bury them. As it were, there they lie, dead and powerless, till they come back new and better characters. Their lives and their deeds, looked at after my own fashion, I write down in my diary, as everyone ought to do. Then, if any of our friends act absurdly, no one need to be vexed about it. Let them bury the offenders out of sight and keep their good temper. They can also read the Intelligencer, which is a paper written by the people with their hands guided. When the time comes for the history of my life to be bound by the grave, then they will write upon it as my epitaph, "The man with a cheerful temper." And this is my story. A story from the sand dunes. This is a story of the sand dunes of Jutland, but it doesn't begin there. No, it begins far away to the south, in Spain. The ocean is the highway between the two countries. So now let your thoughts journey to Spain. It is warm there, and it is beautiful. The fiery red pomegranate blossoms grow among the dark laurels. A refreshing wind from the mountains breathes over the orange gardens and the graceful Moorish palaces with golden cupolas and colored walls. Children walk in procession through the streets, carrying torches and waving banners, while high above them, stars sparkle in the clear, arching vault of heaven. Song and castanets can be heard. Young men and girls dance under the blossoming acacias, while the beggar lies on a carved marble block, quenches his thirst with a juicy watermelon, and dozes his life away. It is all like a beautiful dream. Give yourself up to it. Yes, as did the young married couple, to whom had been granted all the choicest of earthly blessings: health, beauty, good nature, riches, and honor. "We are as happy as anyone could ever be," they said, with full conviction in their hearts. Yet they had one step higher to go to attain complete happiness, and that would be reached when God would give them a child, a son in their own image, body, and soul. That blessed child would be welcomed with jubilance, cared for with the utmost love and tenderness, and be surrounded by all the luxuries that riches and an influential family can provide. Meanwhile, the days glided past, each like a holiday. "Life is a precious gift of love, almost too great to understand," said the wife, "and just to think that this fullness of bliss shall still increase and grow in another life throughout eternity. I can hardly conceive of it. And it certainly also shows the arrogance of people," said her husband. "It really shows a terrible conceit when people persuade themselves to think they'll live forever, become as God. Were these not the words of the serpent, the master of lies? You surely don't doubt that there is a life after this, do you?" asked his young wife, and it was as if a shadow passed through their sunlit thoughts for the first time. "Faith promises it, I know, and the priests tell us it is so," said the young man. "But, happy as I am now, I feel and know that it is only pride, an arrogant thought that demands another life after this, an extension of this happiness. Haven't we been granted enough in this life so that we could and should be satisfied?" "Yes, that has been given us," said the young wife. "But how many thousands find this life a heavy trail? How many have been thrown into this world only to find poverty, shame, sickness, and misfortune? No. If there were no afterlife, the blessings on this earth would be too unequally divided. Our God would not be a God of justice. The beggar down on the street has pleasures just as dear to him as the king enjoys in his splendid palace, said the young man. And what about the poor beast of burden that is beaten and starved and works itself to death? Doesn't it sense the bitterness of its miserable life? Why shouldn't it too demand an afterlife, and call it unfair that it wasn't granted the advantages of a higher creation? Christ told us, "In my Father's house are many mansions," answered the young wife. The kingdom of heaven is as infinite as God's love. The animal is his creation too, and I don't believe that any single life will be lost, but that each will be granted the greatest share of happiness it is capable of receiving. "But this world is good enough for me now," said the young man, as he slipped his arm around his lovely, amiable wife and smoked a cigarette on the open balcony, where the cool air was heavy with the fragrance of orange blossoms and carnations. Songs and the clicking of castanets came from the street, while the stars glittered high above, and two eyes full of love, his wife's eyes, gazed on him with the expression of eternal love. "A moment like this," he said, "makes being born well worth while, just to experience such a moment, and then vanish," he said, smiling, while his wife shook her finger reprovingly. And the cloud soon passed. They were much too happy. Everything that happened seemed only to add to their happiness and well-being. A change came, but it was only a change of place, not a change that diminished their happiness and enjoyment of life. The young man was appointed by the king to be ambassador to the court of Imperial Russia, a post of great honor, such as his birth and ability well fitted him to occupy. He had a great fortune of his own, and his young wife's wealth was equal to his, for she was the daughter of the richest and most respected merchant. And since one of her father's largest and finest ships would sail this year to Stockholm, it was arranged that the dear children, the daughter and the son-in-law, would travel on it to St. Petersburg. Everything was royally fitted out for the voyage, with soft carpets underfoot and silken splendor everywhere. There is an old heroic ballad familiar to all Danes, called "The King of England's Son." He also goes to sea in a splendid ship, with its anchor inlaid with pure gold and every rope woven of silk. The ship of the Spanish merchant might have reminded one of this vessel, for the magnificence was similar, and the farewell thoughts were very much the same. God grant that we meet with joy again. The parting was brief, for a fair wind blew briskly off the Spanish coast. They hoped to reach their destination in a few weeks, but as soon as they were well out at sea, the wind died down to rest. The ocean grew smooth, and the waters reflected the glittering light of the stars of heaven. There were festive evenings in their richly appointed cabin. At last, they wished the wind would rise again to speed them on their voyage. But every wind that arose came from the wrong direction. Weeks went by. 2 whole months passed, in fact, before the wind blew in their favor from the southwest. They were somewhere between Scotland and Jutland when the west wind burst forth, just as in the old ballad, "The King of England's Son." While the sky was dark and the wind blew, and there was neither port nor land in view, they cast their anchor, but to no avail. They were blown to Denmark by a west wind gale. This occurred a long time ago. King Christian Sativin, still a young man, then sat on the throne of Denmark. Much has happened since then. There have been many changes and innovations. Lakes and swamps have become green meadows, while heaths have been plowed into useful land. And in the shelter of the West Jutlander's house, there now grow apple trees and roses. But you must seek these out, for they hide from the sharp west wind. Still, it is easy to imagine yourself back in times more remote than even the reign of Christian VII. For now, as then, the brown heath of Jutland stretches for miles, with its barrows, its mirages, its winding, rough, sandy roads. To the west, where broad streams of water flow into the fjords, there are marshes and meadows, encircled by the high sand hills, which rise up toward the sea like an alpine chain with jagged summits, broken only by high banks of clay. From these, the waves eat off giant mouthfuls year after year, so that the edges and summits topple down as though shaken by an earthquake. That's how it looks today, and that's how it looked many years ago when the happy couple sailed past it in their splendid ship. It was a bright, sunshiny Sunday in late September. The peals of the church bells extended to one another all along the Nissum Fjord. The churches there are like immense stones, each like a piece of rock mountain. The North Sea itself might wash over them, and they would still stand firm. Most of them have no towers, their bells hanging out in the open air between two wooden beams. The services had ended, and the congregation emerged from the house of God into the churchyard, where then, as now, there grew neither tree nor shrub. No plants, flowers, or wreaths adorned the graves. Only rough hillocks showed where the dead had been buried, while sharp grass, beaten flat by the wind, covered the whole cemetery. Here and there a single grave still has a tombstone, perhaps a moldering log, cut in the shape of a coffin. These are pieces of driftwood from the forests of West Jutland. The wild sea provides the shore dwellers with many hewn planks cast upon the coast, but the wind and salt sea spray soon wear away these monuments. One of these blocks had been placed on the grave of child, to which a young woman came from the church. She stopped and gazed down at the rotted wood. Shortly, her husband joined her. They spoke no word. Presently, he took her hand, and together they walked away from the grave, on over the brown heath and over the moor toward the sand dunes. For a long time, they walked in silence. "That was a good sermon today," said the man. "If we didn't have our Lord, we would have nothing." "Yes," replied his wife, "he sends us happiness and sorrow. He has a right to. Our little boy would have been 5 years old tomorrow if we had been allowed to keep him." "It does no good to grieve," said the man. "He is much better off there than here. He is where we pray to go." They said no more, but passed on silently toward their home among the sand dunes. Suddenly, from one of these, where there was no grass to hold the sand down, it looked as if a column of heavy smoke were rising. It was really a gust of wind boring into the bank and whirling the fine particles of sand into the air. A second gust followed, so strong that the strings of fish hung on the line rattled against the walls of the house, but it lasted for only a moment. Then all was quiet again, and the sun shone warmly. The man and his wife went into their house, quickly changed from their Sunday clothes, and then hurried across the dunes, which looked like enormous waves of sand suddenly frozen in motion. The seaweed and the bluish green of the sharp dune grass alone relieved the monotony of the white sand. A couple of neighbors appeared, and all helped in pulling the boats higher up on the sandy shore, while the wind steadily strengthened and blew bitingly cold. When they returned across the dunes, the waves were lifting their whitecaps. Sand and sharp pebbles were beating into their faces, and the wind cut off the top ridges of some of the dunes, breaking them into sand showers. Evening came, and a swelling sound filled the air. There was a howling and wailing like a host of despairing spirits, and even though the fisherman's hut lay near the shore, the noise of the wind drowned the roar of the sea. The sand drifted against the window panes, and every now and then there came a violent gust of wind that seemed to shake the house to its very foundation. It was a dark evening. The moon would not rise until nearly midnight. The air cleared a little, but the storm was now raging with all its fury over the deep, black ocean. The fisherman and his wife had long since gone to bed, but in such weather it was impossible to close an eye. Suddenly there was a tap at the window. The door was pushed open, and someone said, "A large ship is stranded on the outer reef." In a moment, the man and his wife were out of bed and dressing themselves hurriedly. The moon was up now, and it would have been light enough to see had it not been for the flying sand which forced eyes to squint. Only with great difficulty, waiting for each lull and creeping a little farther between gusts, could they make their way across the sand dunes. And now, like swan's down in the air, salty white foam flew in from the sea as it hurled its waves against the coast in boiling fury. Only a long, experienced eye could have distinguished the ship way out there. It was a splendid two-master. At that very instant it was lifted over the reef, 3 or 4 cables' lengths off the usual channel. It drove on toward land, struck against the second reef, and there stuck fast. It was impossible to send any help, for the sea was far too tumultuous. Waves broke over the entire vessel. They imagined hearing screams of terror, the cries of death agony. They could see the aimless rushing to and fro on board. It was all hopeless, helpless. Now a wave like a thundering avalanche crashed down on the bowsprit, and then it disappeared. The stern rose high above the water, and 2 people could be seen leaping from it into the sea. They disappeared. A moment more, and a tremendous wave, thundering toward the dunes, flung a body on the shore. It was a woman, and surely she was dead. A couple of women who quickly gathered around her believed she showed signs of life, and carried her over the dunes to the fisherman's cottage. How beautiful and dainty she was! No doubt a lady of rank. They laid her in the fisherman's humble bed. There was no linen to wrap her in, only a woolen blanket. But at least this was warm and comfortable. She breathed, but she was in a high fever. She had no idea where she was or what had happened. Perhaps this was just as well, for all that was dear to her now lay at the bottom of the ocean. They had met the same fate as those sung of in the ballad about the King of England's son. A sorrowful sight it was to all. The ship was broken into pieces, small. Many bits of the wreck were driven ashore, but the lady alone survived of all the voyagers. Still, the wind howled and wailed along the coast. For a few minutes she seemed to rest, but then came screams of pain and fear. Her beautiful eyes opened, and she spoke a few words, but no one could understand her. At last, after hours of suffering and struggles, there nestled in her arms a tiny, newborn child. That child was to have rested under silken curtains in a beautiful home, was to have been welcomed to a life full of this world's riches. But our Lord had willed that he should be born in this humble hut, and not so much as one kiss was he to receive from the lips of his mother. The fisherman's wife placed the baby against its mother's heart, a heart that beat no longer. She was dead, and the child who was to have been brought up in luxury and pleasure had been hurled headlong into life, tossed by the sea among the sand dunes, there to experience the lot of a poor man and weary and dark days. And always the old song comes to our mind. On the king's son's cheek there was a tear. Pray, Christ, I reach Bovjörg, then I shan't fear. If only I had come to Herr Bugge's strand, then no knight nor squire of any band would have dared against me lift a hand. The ship had been wrecked a little to the south of the Nissum fjord, on the very shore that Herr Bugge had once called his own. The hard, cruel times of the ballad, when the dwellers on the western coast treated castaways so inhumanly, had long passed. The shipwrecked were now treated with love and kindness, as they are in our own time. The dying mother and the unfortunate child would have been treated with the utmost care and tenderness, wherever the storm had driven them. But nowhere could they have received more sincere kindness than in the hut of that poor fisherwoman who, only yesterday, had stood with a sorrowful heart beside the grave of her child, who, if God had allowed him to live, would today have completed his 5th year. No one knew the identity of the dead woman or from where she had come. The broken fragments of the wrecked ship brought no explanation. No letter or news of the daughter and son-in-law was ever received at the rich merchant's house in Spain. They could not have reached their destination, considering the violent storms that had raged for the last few weeks. For months they waited before admitting to themselves the sad truth. All lost, all perished. But in the hut of the fisherman near the sand dunes of Hunsby, there was now a tiny infant. Where God provides food for 2, there is sure to be enough for a 3rd. And near the sea there is always at least a plate of fish for hungry mouths. They christened the little one Jürgen. Surely he must be a Jewish child, people said. His skin is so dark. He may just as easily be Italian or Spanish, said the clergyman. To the fisherman's wife, all 3 races seemed very much the same. But it was a great comfort to her to know that at least the child was really a baptized Christian. The boy thrived, his noble blood sustaining warmth and gaining strength from the poor fare as he grew in that humble hut. The Danish language, as spoken in West Jutland, became his own language. The pomegranate seed from Spain had become a sea grass plant on Jutland's western coast, and in this home, so foreign to his inheritance, he took root for the rest of his life. He was to experience hunger and cold, a poor man's wants and troubles, but also he was to know a poor man's pleasures. For everyone, childhood has its high lights, and the memories of these sparkle throughout one's whole life. What a full share of play and pleasure he had. All the miles of shore were strewn with playthings for him. It was a mosaic of pebbles, red as coral, yellow as amber, or white and round as birds' eggs, all bright with colors and smooth and polished by the sea. Even the dried-out skeleton of a fish, the water plants dried by the wind, or the shiny white seaweed, long and narrow like strings fluttering among the rocks, were a delight to eye and heart. The boy was a wide-awake child, full of ability. How he could remember all the old stories or songs he had ever heard, and how clever he was with his fingers. He could make sailing ships out of stones and shells, or draw pictures that were quite an ornament to the room. He could carve his thoughts out of a stick, as his foster mother said, when he was still only a little boy, and his voice was so sweet and caught the strain of a melody so quickly. That little heart was attuned to many fine harmonies, which might have rung throughout the world if he had been placed in a less narrow home than the fisherman's hut near the North Sea. One day, a box of rare flower bulbs drifted ashore after a shipwreck. Some were taken out and made into soup with the idea that they might be good to eat. Others were just left to rot in the sand and never fulfilled their destiny, never unfolded the glorious beauty of form and color that lay hidden within them. Would such be the case with Jürgen? Life was soon over for the flower bulbs, but he still had many years to live and struggle. It never occurred either to him or his foster parents that their lives were lonely and monotonous. Days went by, and there was plenty to do and hear and see. The ocean itself was a great book of lessons. Every day it seemed to turn over a new page, storm or calm. A shipwreck was an exciting event. The visit to the church was a festive event. Twice a year the fisherman's hut had a visitor, and a very welcome one. This was the eel seller from Fjaltring, up near Bovbjerg, who was the brother of Jürgen's foster mother. He came with a red wagon full of eels. It was shut up like a box, and had blue and white tulips painted on it. It was drawn by 2 black oxen, and Jürgen was permitted to drive them. The eelman had a good head on him. He was a jolly guest. He always brought a little keg of schnapps, and everyone had a drink of it, sometimes from a coffee cup, if there were not enough glasses. Even Jürgen, little as he was, had a thimbleful. That was so he could digest the fat eels, said the eelman. Then he would tell them his old story, and whenever he heard people laugh at it, he always repeated it at once, to the very same people, as all talkative folks do. And as Jürgen used phrases from this story throughout his youth and later in life, we had better listen to it. The eels played out in the river, and Mother Eel said to her daughters, when they had begged for permission to explore a little way up the stream, "Don't go too far. The wicked man with his spear will come and catch you all." But they did go too far, and of the 8 of them, only 3 returned to their mother and wailed out their story. We had only gone a little distance beyond the door when the ugly man with the spear came and stabbed our 5 sisters to death. "They'll come back," said the eel mother. "No," said the daughters, "for he skinned them and cut them into bits and fried them." "They'll surely come back," said the eel mother. "Yes, but he ate them." "Still they'll come back," said the eel mother. "But he drank schnapps afterwards," said the daughters. Oh my," howled the eel mother. "Then they'll never return, for schnapps drowns eels. And for that very reason people should always take a little schnapps after eating them," finished the eel spearer. And this story ran like a thread of gold tinsel, his most humorous recollection, through the web of Jürgen's life. He too wanted to go past the threshold, a little way up the river, or rather out into the wide world in a ship, but his foster mother objected, just as Mother Eel had objected. There are so many wicked men with spears. He longed to go a little past the sand dunes into the heath, and at last he did for 4 pleasant days, the brightest of his whole childhood, and he saw all of Jutland's happy, home-like beauty and sunshine. He went to a party. It was a funeral party. A wealthy relative of the fisherman had died. His farm was far inland, to the east, a bit northerly, as the saying goes. Jurgen's foster parents had to go, and they took him with them. They passed from the dunes over heath and swamp to the green pastures where the Skjarum River hollows out its bed, that brook full of eels, where lived Mother Eel and her daughters, whom the wicked people speared and cut in pieces. And hadn't men often acted just as cruelly toward their fellow men? The good knight, Sir Bug, whose name lives in the old song, was murdered by wicked men. And though he himself was called good, he is said to have come very close to slaying the architect who built his castle with its tower and thick walls on the slope where the brook Skjarum falls into the Nisum Fjord, just where Jurgen now stood with his foster parents. The ramparts and the red, crumbling fragments of the walls could still be seen. It was here that Sir Bugge, after the architect had left, ordered one of his men to follow him. "Say to him, 'Master, the tower leans to one side, and if he turns and looks to find out, you must slay him and take from him the money I have paid him. But if he turns not, let him depart in peace.'" The man obeyed, but the architect did not turn. Rather did he answer clearly and boldly, "The tower does not lean, for I have built it well. But one day a man shall come from the west in a blue cloak, and he shall make it lean." And 100 years later this came to pass, for the North Sea broke in and the tower collapsed. But Predbjörn Guldenstjerne, who owned the castle at that time, built a new mansion on the slope higher up. This is still standing and is called Nøre Vosborg. Jurgen and his foster parents had to pass this place, so now he saw this and other spots that he had heard stories about in the long winter evenings. He saw the castle, with its double moats choked with trees and bushes, and its rampart overhung with bracken. But the loveliest sight to him were the tall lime trees that reached right up to the roof and filled the air with fragrance. In the northwest corner of the garden stood a large bush bearing flowers as white as snow. They seemed strange to him among the green leaves of summer. It was an elder bush, the first he had seen. Blooming, that bush and the lime trees were stored safely away throughout the years in a corner of his mind, a bit of the fragrance and beauty of Denmark, kept to delight the old man. The journey continued and became still more pleasant, for outside Nøre Vosborg, where they had found the flowering elder bush, they met other people who were also going to the funeral and drove on with them. Of course, all three of them had to sit on a little wooden chest with iron trimmings at the rear of the carriage, but they decided even that was better than walking. The carriage rolled away over the rough hillocks of the heath, and the oxen that drew it stopped to graze whenever a patch of fresh grass appeared among the heather. The sun shone warmly, and they saw the strange sight of rising smoke in the distance, as transparent as though beams of light were rolling and dancing over the heath. "That is Loki driving his flock," people said, and that was enough explanation for Jurgen. He felt as though he were driving right into fairyland. And yet everything was real. And how still it all was about them. The heath spread out before them, a wide, rich carpet, with the heather in blossom. Mingled with the dark green juniper and fresh oak shoots, it studded the ground as if with bouquets. This was an inviting place to throw oneself down, if it were not for the many poisonous snakes people said were there. And people spoke, too, of the wolves that used to be found there so often that the district was known as Ulvborg Herod. The old man who was driving the wagon told them how, in his father's day, The horses often had fierce battles with wild beasts since exterminated, and how one morning he found a horse trampling on a wolf he had slain, while his own legs were quite bare of flesh which had been gnawed off in the struggle. The wagon rolled too quickly over the rough heath and through the deep sand. They reached the house of mourning, where they found many strangers inside and outside. Many wagons stood side by side, with their horses or oxen turned out to seek meager pasture. From the back of the house, great sand dunes, like those at home near the sea, extended far and wide. How could they be here? It was 12 miles into the country, yet they were as tall and large as those by the shore. The wind had lifted them up and blown them here. They, too, had a history. Psalms were sung, and a few of the older people wept. But aside from this, everything was very pleasant, Jürgen thought. There was plenty to eat and drink, the finest fat eels, with schnapps afterwards, to settle the eels, as the eel seller had said. And his words were certainly carried out at this gathering. Jürgen went in and out of the house, and by the third day he was as thoroughly at home, there as in the fisherman's hut among his own sand dunes, where he had spent all his life. But the heath here was far more beautiful, with its myriads of brilliant blossoms and luscious, sweet bilberries, growing so thickly that if one stepped on them, the ground became stained with their red juice. Here lay an old Viking grave, and near it lay another. When the mysterious columns of mist curled upward through the calm air, they said, "The heath is on fire." It shone brightest toward evening. But the fourth day came at last, and brought the end of the wake. It was time to return from the inland sand dunes to the coastal sand dunes. "Ours are the real ones after all," said the father. "These have no strength." Then they talked about the sand dunes and how they came to be here, and this was very interesting. The peasants found a corpse on the shore and buried it in the churchyard. Then the sand began to fly about, and the sea broke in with violence. A wise man of the parish advised that the grave be opened, for if the stranger were found sucking his thumb, they could then be sure that he whom they had buried was a merman, and that the sea would not rest till it had fetched him back. So they opened the grave, and sure enough, the dead man lay with his thumb between his lips. He was quickly laid on a cart drawn by 2 oxen, and as though stung by hornets, they rushed with him over heath and moor to the sea. That stopped the shower of flying sand, but the dunes that it formed are still there. That was what Jürgen learned and carried away with him from the happiest days of his childhood, those 4 days at the funeral party. How wonderful it was, he thought, to go out into the world and see new places and new people. And he was to go still farther away. Before he had finished his 14th year, he was still a child. He did actually go out to look at a world through the eyes of a cabin boy. Now he had to endure bad weather, rough seas, and evil men, scanty fare, cold nights, the rope's end, and blows from a hard fist. Yes, such were his experiences. There was something in his noble Spanish blood that continually boiled over and brought hot words to his lips. He soon learned it was wisest to restrain them, but in doing so, he felt somewhat as the eel must feel when it is skinned, cut up, and tossed into the frying pan. "I shall return again," said a voice within him. Now the ship touched at the Spanish coast, the home of Jürgen's parents, in fact at the very town where they used to live in splendor and happiness. But he knew nothing of his homeland or his relatives, and even less did his family know of him. The shabby cabin boy was not even permitted to go ashore while the others went. But on the last day it happened that some provisions had been bought, and Jürgen was told to carry them on board. There stood Jürgen in his wretched clothes that looked as if they had been washed in a ditch and dried in a chimney. This was the first time that he, the dweller of the sand dunes, had ever seen a great city. How tall the houses were, how narrow the streets, swarming with human beings constantly rushing to and fro, a regular whirlpool of townspeople and farmers, monks and soldiers. A clamor, a screaming, a jangling of bells from asses and mules, a clanging of bigger bells from the churches, song and musical instruments, knocking and hammering, for every tradesman seemed to have his shop either on his threshold or on the sidewalk. And all the while, the hot sun burned down, and the air was heavy. It was as if one had entered a bake oven full of beetles, cockchafers, bees, and flies, all humming and buzzing with all their might. Jürgen hardly knew if he were walking or standing still. Suddenly he saw before him the mighty portals of a cathedral, with lights streaming out through the twilight of the colonnades, and the fragrance of incense saluting him. Even the poorest beggar in rags could venture to climb those stairs and enter. The sailor who had taken Jürgen ashore went into the church. Jürgen followed, and soon he stood in the sanctuary. Colored pictures glowed out from golden backgrounds. Amid flowers and candles at the altar, he beheld the Blessed Virgin holding the Holy Child. Priests in their vestments were chanting, while pretty choir boys swung silver censers. What magnificence he saw there! All this glory and beauty, streaming into Jürgen's soul, nearly overpowered him. The church and the faith of his fathers surrounded him and awakened a chord in his soul, causing tears to come to his eyes. From the cathedral they proceeded to the market. A heavy load of provisions was piled upon him. It was a long way back, and when he grew tired, he wanted to rest in front of a large and splendid palace, decorated with statues and marble pillars, with broad steps. But as he rested his burden against the wall, a porter dressed in gold lace bustled out, waving a silver-headed cane, and drove him away. Him, the grandson of that house. But no one knew it, himself least of all. And so he returned to the ship and accepted, as before, his share of cuffs, broken slumbers, and hard work. Such was his first experience in life. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth, they say. Yes, if he makes up for it in old age. When the term of his signing on was ended, and the ship was anchored in the Ringkjøbing fjord, he went home to the Hunsby sand dunes. But his foster mother was dead. She had died during his voyage. A hard winter followed, with snowstorms raging over sea and land. It was difficult to get from one place to another. How differently are things divided in this life. Here were icy, cold, and driving snowstorms, while in Spain the sun burned too fiercely. And yet one clear, frosty day, while Jürgen watched the swans flying from the ocean across the Nissum fjord toward Nørre he felt that here, in the northern land, he could breathe more freely. And Denmark had its beauty of summer, too. He imagined he could see the heath with its flowers and ripe, juicy berries, while the lime trees and elder bush of Nørre stood blooming before him. He must go back there again. It was toward spring, and the fishing began. Jürgen helped, for he had grown during the last year. He was quick and alert at his work, and there was no lack of spirit in him. He could swim and tread water, turn over and tumble in the water. They often warned him to beware of the mackerel shoals, which, it is said, seize the best swimmer, drag him down into the water, and eat him. That would be the end of him. But that never happened to Jürgen. Among his neighbors on the sand dunes was a boy named Morten. He and Jürgen had become good friends, and now they shipped out together on a vessel bound for Norway. Afterwards, they went to Holland together. They had never quarreled, but when one is hot-blooded by nature, one can easily start something. And that Jürgen did one day, over nothing. They were sitting together behind the cabin door, eating off the same clay dish, when Jürgen, who held his pocket knife in his hand, raised it toward Morten with a threatening gesture, his cheeks deadly pale and his eyes blazing with fury. But Morten only said, "So you're the sort who uses a knife?" At those words, Jürgen's hand was lowered. He said no word, but finished his dinner and went off to work. Morten said, "Hit me in the face. I deserve it. There's something in me that's always boiling over." "Oh, forget it," said Morten, and they became better friends than ever. When they had returned home to the sand dunes, and people heard the story of this quarrel, they said that Jürgen was like a pot that easily boiled over, but that he was an honest pot anyway. "But he's no Jutlander. No one can call him a Jutland pot," was Morten's witty answer. They were both young and healthy, well-built and with strong limbs. Jürgen was the more active. Up in Norway, the peasants go into the mountains and take their cattle there to find pasture. On the western coast of Jutland, the fishermen build huts among the sand dunes. They build them with planks from shipwrecks and cover them over with heath and turf. Here the fishermen live and sleep during the early spring. Each fisherman has a girl as a servant. She is called his eisepige. She supplies the bait for the hooks, must be ready on the wharf with warm ale to refresh him, and cooks his food when he returns to his hut, tired and hungry. The girls carry the fish up from the boat, cut it up, and, in short, have plenty to do. Jürgen, his foster father, a few other fishermen and their girls had a hut together. Morten lived in the next hut. One of the girls, named Elsa, had known Jürgen ever since they were both little children. They were quite fond of each other and always happy to be together. They were much alike in disposition, but quite different in appearance, for Jürgen was very dark-complexioned, while her skin was white, her hair as yellow as flax, and her eyes as blue as the sea on a sunny day. One day, Elsa and Jürgen were walking together, and Jürgen was holding her hand in a warm, fervent grasp, when she said to him, "Jürgen, I want to unburden my heart to you. Let me be your eisepige instead of Morten's. I know he has hired me, but you're like a brother to me, and Morten, he and I are sweethearts. But now, don't go and tell everybody else about it." Jürgen felt as if the sand dunes were whirling beneath him. He didn't say a word. He only nodded, and that was the same as saying, "Yes." This was all that was necessary to make him feel a bitter hatred in his heart for Morten. The more he thought about it, the clearer he realized that Morten had robbed him of the only creature he loved. Never before had he understood his own feelings toward Elsa, and now all hope of winning her for himself was gone. When the fishermen are returning home over a fairly rough sea, it is interesting to see how the boats pass over the sand reefs. One man stands upright while the rest watch him, sitting with their oars ready to use the moment he signals that a great wave is coming, which will lift the boat over the reef. It comes, and the vessel is tossed up so that its very keel can be seen from the shore. In another moment, the entire boat vanishes from sight, and neither boat, men, nor mast can be seen. You might imagine the ocean has swallowed everything up. Another moment, and the boat reappears, crawling up the wave like a mighty sea monster, its oars moving like the creature's legs. The second and third reefs are crossed in the same way, and then the fishermen spring into shallow water and drag their boat ashore. Every wave helps them until finally they have it beyond the reach of the breakers. But the slightest mistake in the signal, when passing those reefs, the delay of a moment, and they would be shipwrecked. It would soon be all over with me and Morton too, if that happened, came into Jurgen's mind out at sea. They were approaching the outer reef when his foster father suddenly became seriously ill. The fever had seized him. Jurgen jumped up and stood in the bow. "Father, let me take your place," he said, and his eyes moved from Morton to the sea, and from the sea back to Morton, as the oars swung on with the steady strokes, and the great wave rolled toward them. Then suddenly, his look fell on the pale face of his foster father, and he could not obey his wicked impulse. The boat crossed the reefs in safety, and in safety they came ashore. But that evil thought still lurked in Jurgen's heart, and roused every little fiber of bitterness that he remembered from his childhood days. But he could not weave the fibers together, so he dismissed it all from his mind. He felt that Morton had robbed him, and that was reason enough to hate him. Some of the fishermen noticed the change in Jurgen, but Morton himself saw nothing. He was just the same as ever, ready to help and eager to talk. In fact, a little too much of the latter. Jurgen's foster father took to his bed. It became his deathbed. For a week later, he was dead. Jurgen was his heir, now master of the cottage behind the sand dunes. It was a poor enough hut, but still it was something, and Morton didn't have so much. "I suppose you won't go to sea again, Jurgen," said one of the old fishermen. "You'll always stay with us now." But that was by no means Jurgen's thought. On the contrary, he thought about seeing some more of the world. The eel seller up at Fjaltring had a cousin up at Old Skagen, also a fisherman, but wealthy, and a shipowner too. They said he was a kindly old man, with whom it would be very pleasant to take service. Old Skagen lies way up at the northern part of Jutland, as far away from the Hunsby sand dunes as one can go. That part of the idea pleased Jurgen best. He had no intention of attending the wedding of Elsa and Morton, which was to take place in a couple of weeks. It was foolish for Jurgen to go away, said the old fisherman. Now that he had a house of his own, Elsa would very likely prefer him to Morton. Jurgen's reply was so abrupt that it wasn't easy to make out his meaning. The old man brought Elsa to him. She didn't say much, but she did say, "You have a house, that must be considered." And Jurgen did consider many things. The ocean has its heavy waves, but the waves of the human heart are even heavier. Many thoughts, strong and weak, passed through Jurgen's heart and head before he asked Elsa, "Suppose Morton had a house as good as mine. Which of us would you rather have?" "But Morton doesn't have one, and never will have one." "But suppose he did have one?" "Why, then I'd take Morton, of course, for that's the way I feel about him. But one must have something to live on." All night Jurgen thought over this answer. There was something within him, he found, something he himself couldn't figure out. It was stronger even than his love for Elsa. He went to Morton, and what he said and did had been well considered. He offered to sell his house to him on the lowest possible terms, explaining that it would please him better to go to sea again. When Elsa heard about it, she thanked him with a kiss, for she really did love Morton better. Jürgen was going to leave early next morning. Late the evening before, he had a sudden desire to go to see Morton once more. On his way among the sand dunes, he met the old fisherman, who greatly disapproved of his leaving, and who declared Morton must carry a charm sewn up in his pocket to make the young girls fall in love with him. Jürgen brushed aside such talk and bade him farewell. Then he proceeded to Morton's hut, where he heard loud voices. Evidently, Morton was not alone. For a moment, Jürgen stood irresolute. Least of all did he want to meet Elsa there, and now that he thought it over, he would prefer not having Morton thank him all over again. So he turned back without entering. Next morning, before daylight, he tied up his bundle, gathered his provisions, and started through the sand dunes to the shore. It was easier walking by the sea than along the heavy, sandy road, and besides it was shorter, for he was going first to Fjaltring, near Bovbjerg, where lived the eel seller, whom he had promised to visit. The ocean was smooth and blue, and as he walked he crushed under his feet the shells and pebbles, the playthings of his childhood. As he was walking, his nose began to bleed, and a couple of large drops fell on his sleeve. It seemed a trivial enough matter, but a trivial matter can sometimes be of importance. He soon stopped the bleeding, wiped his sleeve, and walked on. It seemed as if this had cleared both his heart and head. When he found sea kale growing in the sand, he broke off a branch and stuck it in his hat, determined to be joyful and happy. Wasn't he going out into the world a little way up the river, as the young eels had so longed to do? But beware of wicked people, who will spear you, skin you, cut you in pieces, and lay you in dishes, he repeated to himself. I'll slip through the world whole-skinned. Courage is a strong weapon. The sun was already high when he reached the narrow inlet between the North Sea and the Nissum Fjord. Then he looked back and made out in the distance 2 men on horseback, with others following them, all riding at great speed. This did not concern him. The ferry boat was on the opposite side of the bay, but Jürgen shouted till it came across for him. He sprang on board, but before the ferry was halfway across, the men who had followed him on horseback arrived on the shore, and with threatening gestures called for him to return in the name of the law. Jürgen couldn't imagine what it meant, but thought it would be best to return. So he took the oar himself and rowed back. In an instant, the men had leaped into the boat, and before he was aware of it, they had bound his hands together with a rope. "It's well you're caught," they said. "Your crime will cost you your life." He was accused of nothing less than murder. Morton had been found stabbed in the neck with a knife. Late, the evening before, one of the fishermen had met Jürgen on his way to Morton's house, and it was remembered that it wasn't the first time Jürgen had threatened Morton with a knife. There seemed no doubt that he was the murderer. Now the question was where to confine him. Ringkjøbing was the proper place, but it was a long way off, and the wind was against them. In less than half an hour they had crossed Skjærum Fjord, and now they were only a quarter of a mile from Nøre Vosborg, which was a strong mansion with moats and ramparts. One of the men in the boat was the brother of the keeper of this mansion. He suggested that they might get permission to confine Jürgen, for the time being, in the dungeon where Long Margrethe the gypsy had been imprisoned until her execution. No one listened to Jürgen's denials, and those few drops of blood on his shirt were silent witnesses against him. Conscious of his innocence and of the fact that there was no chance of his being cleared, he calmly resigned himself to his fate. They landed near the old rampart, where the castle of Sir Booga had stood. It was the very same spot that Jürgen's feet had trodden years before, when he had gone with his foster parents to the funeral party, where he had spent those 4 happy days on the heath. By the very same path they now led him up to Nure Vosborg. And here, as then, the elderbush was in full bloom, and the tall lime trees wafted their fragrance to him. He might have imagined it was only yesterday that he had been here last. Under the grand staircase, in the western wing of the building, a passage leads into a low-roofed, vaulted cell. It was from here that Long Margrethe was led to her execution. She had confessed to having devoured the hearts of 5 children, and believed that, could she have eaten 2 more, she would have been able to make herself invisible and fly away. In the cell was a tiny, narrow air hole in the wall, but the lime trees outside sent none of their refreshing fragrance within. All was cold, damp, and moldy. There was only a rough bench in the cell, but a good conscience makes an easy pillow, so Jürgen could really lie comfortably. The thick wooden door was closed and the iron bolts were shot, but superstition can creep through the keyhole of a mansion as well as a fisherman's hut. And as Jürgen lay in the silence and darkness, he could not help thinking of Long Margrethe and her horrible crimes. Her last thoughts had filled that narrow dungeon the night before her execution. Nor could he help remembering the black arts that had been practiced by the owner of this mansion, Herr Swanvedel, when he lived there many years ago, and how the watchdog that guarded the bridge had every morning been found hung in his chains across the railing. Such thoughts came to Jürgen's mind and made him shiver. But a sunbeam, a refreshing thought from without, also came to his mind, the remembrance of the blossoming elder and lime trees. He was not left here long, but was removed to Ringkjøbing. But there his imprisonment was none the less rigorous. For Jürgen's times were not like ours. They were hard times for poor men. Peasant farms and peasant settlements were still being converted into new knights' estates. The coachman or valet of a nobleman was often appointed village judge, with power to condemn the peasant to a severe flogging or the loss of all his property for some trifling offense. And thus, in Jutland, far from the king's Copenhagen and the wise and just rulers of state, the law took its course with little regard for justice. Jürgen could expect that his case would be delayed. His wretched cell was bitterly cold. When would this misery end? Innocent, he had been thrown into misfortune and sorrow. That was his lot. He had plenty of time to think over the hard dealing that this world had given him, and to wonder why this fate had been allotted him. Still, all would correct itself in that second life, which assuredly awaits us. In the poor fisherman's cottage that faith had taken firm root in his soul, the light that, even amid the sunshine and plenty of Spain, could not pierce the darkness of his father's mind, was sent to him to comfort him in poverty and distress, a sign of the mercy of God, which never disappoints. Now the spring storms settled in. The roaring of the North Sea can be heard for miles inland, and when the tempests abate, there is a thundering as of hundreds of heavy wagons rolling over a hard, tunneled road. In his dungeon, Jürgen heard this sound, and it was a relief to him. No old melodies could so move him as the music of the rolling ocean, the boundless ocean that had carried him throughout the world with the speed of winds, the ocean over which men pass, carrying their own house with them like the snails carry theirs, always standing on their own native ground, even in foreign lands. How he listened to that deep thunder, how his thoughts surged into a turmoil within him. Free, free, how wonderful to be free, even if with a patched shirt and shoes without soles. Sometimes his soul burned with indignant anger, and he pounded the wall with his clenched fist. Weeks, months, a whole year passed, and then the gypsy Niels Tive, the horse dealer as he was called, was picked up, and then better times came. It was established that Jürgen was innocent. The evening before Jürgen's departure, the night of the murder, Morten and Niels Tive had met at a little tavern north of Ringkjøbing Fjord. A couple of glasses were emptied, not enough to get drunk on, but enough to loosen Morten's tongue. He began to boast of having bought a house and of getting married. And when Niels asked from where he was getting the money, Morten proudly slapped his hand to his pocket. "The money's here, right where it ought to be," he said. This boast cost him his life, for when he rose to go, Niels followed him and stabbed him in the back with a knife, all for the sake of money that was not in his pocket at all. There was a great deal of talk about the affair, but for us it is enough to know that Jürgen was released. But what compensation did he receive for the long, weary days he spent in the cold and loneliness, and for being despised by his fellowmen? Why, he was told it was lucky for him he was innocent. Now he could go. To be sure, the mayor gave him 10 marks for traveling expenses, and several citizens of Ringkjøbing offered him beer and good food, for there are a few kind hearts in the world. Not all men spear, skin, and devour their fellows, but the best thing of all was that a merchant from Skagen named Brønne, the same man with whom Jürgen had intended to take service before his imprisonment, had come to Ringkjøbing on business at just that time and heard the whole story. He was kind-hearted and sympathized with Jürgen's sufferings. Now he would do him a little kindness and prove to him that there are some good people in the world. Out of prison, not only to freedom, but to a paradise of love and kindness. But it is no man's fate to drain a cup of unmixed bitterness. If even man could not endure to offer such to his fellow man, how could the all-loving God? "Let the past be dead and buried," said Merchant Brunn. "We'll draw a heavy black line over the last year and burn the calendar, and in 2 days we'll be off together for Skagen. Happy, friendly, peaceful Skagen. People call it the out-of-the-way corner of the country. It's a blessed chimney corner with windows opening out to the whole wide world. What a journey! To breathe the fresh air again, to emerge from the cold, damp prison air into the warm sunshine. The heath was gay with blooming heather. The shepherd boy perched on a warrior's grave mound, shrilling his flute made from sheep bones. Fata Morgana, the beautiful mirage of the desert, flaunted her hanging gardens and floating woods, and the wonderful transparent phenomenon called Loki driving his flock could be seen. They traveled up toward the Lime Fjord, toward Skagen, through the land of the Vens, whence the men with the long beards, which had earned them the name of Lombards, had emigrated when, in the days of the famine under King Sneo, it was decreed that all the children and old people should be put to death. But Gambaruk, a noble woman of great wealth, had proposed instead that all the young should leave the country. Jürgen was learned enough to know all this, And although he had never seen the land of the Lombards beyond the Alps, he could easily picture it to himself. For had he not in his boyhood seen the south, Spain? He could remember clearly the piled heaps of fruit, the scarlet pomegranate blossoms, the noise and din and ringing of bells in that great beehive of a city. But he still loved best the land of his home, and Jørgen's home was Denmark. At last they reached Vendilskaga, as Skagen is called in the Old Norse and Icelandic sagas. Even then, Old Skagen, with its Easter and Wester town, stretched for miles with sand dunes and farmland as far as the lighthouse near Grenien. Houses and farms were strewn among the shifting sand dunes. It is a wild land where the wind plays constantly in the loose sand, and where the screams of seagulls, sea swallows, and wild swans cut sharply through the eardrum. A few miles southwest of Grenien is High or Old Skagen. Here merchant Bruna lived, and here Jørgen would now live. The house was tarred. Each of the little outhouses had an inverted boat for a roof, and driftwood joined together formed the pigsty. There was no enclosure, for there was nothing to enclose, but on ropes, strung in long rows one above another, hung countless fishes drying in the wind. The whole shore was strewn with dead herring. In fact, the nets could hardly be thrown into the sea before they would be filled with them. Great loads of herring were caught and taken inland. They were so plentiful that many were often thrown back into the sea or left to rot on the sand. The merchant's wife and daughter, and even the servants, rushed out in delight to greet the father when they arrived home. There was such handshaking, so much noise, so much to talk about, and the daughter had such a sweet face and lovely eyes. The house was cozy and roomy inside. The table was set with plates of fish, flounder fit for a king, and wine from Skagen's own vineyard, the great ocean, from which the grapes drifted ashore already pressed, both in barrels and bottles. When mother and daughter had heard who Jørgen was and learned how cruelly he, an innocent man, had been treated, they looked upon him with kindness, and the beautiful Miss Clara's bright eyes sparkled more warmly than before. Jørgen found a blessed home in Old Skagen. It did his heart good. It had suffered so much cruelty, even the bitterness of love, which either softens or hardens the heart. But Jørgen was still young, his heart still soft, and there was a vacant place in it. For that reason, it was perhaps just as well that in 3 weeks Clara was to sail for Kristiansand in Norway to spend the winter with an aunt. The Sunday before her departure, all were to go together to Holy Communion. The church was large and stately, built by the Dutch and Scotch many centuries before, and quite a distance from where the town is now situated. The church was somewhat dilapidated now, and the way through the deep sand made hard walking, but people did not mind these difficulties to get to the house of God, to sing psalms, and to hear the sermon. The sand was piled up outside the wall around the cemetery, but the graves had still been kept free of it. It was the largest church north of the Lime Fjord. The Virgin Mary, with a golden crown on her head, and the infant Savior in her arms, was painted in bright colors above the altar. The holy apostles were ranged around the choir, and high on the wall there hung portraits of Skagen's old burgomasters and councilmen, with their insignia of office. The pulpit was carved. The sun shone brightly into the church, lighting up the polished brass chandelier and the little vessel that hung down from the roof. Jørgen was overwhelmed by the same pure, childlike feeling of devotion that had thrilled his soul when, a boy, he had stood in the rich Spanish cathedral. But here the feeling was different, for in this place he felt that he was one of the congregation. After the sermon came the communion, and when Jürgen knelt with the others to receive the consecrated bread and wine, he found that he was kneeling next to Miss Clara. But his thoughts were so raised to God and the Holy Sacrament that not until they rose did he realize that she had been his neighbor. Then he saw the salt tears rolling down her cheeks. 2 days later, she sailed for Norway, and Jürgen went out to help on the farm and with the fishing. There were more fish to be caught there in those days than there are now. Shoals of mackerel shone brightly in the darkness of the night, thus betraying the course they were following. The sea robins snarled, and the crabs gave pitiful cries. When they were caught, fish are not as voiceless as people say. Jürgen was more quiet than they. He kept his secret, and yet some day it would perhaps burst forth. Every Sunday when he sat in church and his eyes rested on the picture of the Virgin Mother, they also paused a moment on the spot where Miss Clara had knelt beside him, and he thought of her and her kindness to him. The autumn brought its rain and sleet. The water rose up in the town of Skagen, for the sand could not absorb it all. People had to wade through it, and sometimes even sail through the streets in boats. Snowstorms and sandstorms followed. Ship after ship was wrecked on those fatal reefs. The sand whirled about and buried the houses until the occupants had to creep out through the chimneys. But that was not an unusual occurrence there. Indoors were comfort and warmth. The blazing and crackling fires were fed with peat or with dried wood from the wrecks, and Merchant Brunn read aloud from an old chronicle. He read about Prince Hamlet of Denmark, and of how he landed from England and fought a great battle near Bovbjerg. His grave was at Ramme, only a few miles from the eel seller's home, where the heath was like an immense cemetery, studded with hundreds of Viking grave mounds. Merchant Brunne had visited Hamlet's grave. There was more talk of the olden days and of their English and Scottish neighbors, and then Jürgen sang the old ballad about the King of England's son, about the stately ship, and how it was decked out. The blessed words of our dear Lord were written in gold on panels aboard. On the prow, in colors rare, the king's son clasped his maiden fair. Jürgen sang this verse with especial sincerity, while his eyes, luminous and black from his birth, sparkled with more fire than ever. Thus the evenings passed pleasantly, with song and reading. All were happy in that house, even the very animals. The tin shelves gleamed with clean plates, hams and sausages hung under the ceiling, and they had winter supplies in abundance. Many rich farmhouses like this are still to be found in West Jutland, abundant as this one in good comfort, good cheer, good sense, and good humor, and like the tent of an Arab for hospitality. Jürgen had never spent so happy a time, at least since the 4 days of the funeral, when he was a child. And still Miss Clara was absent, but she was never absent from their thoughts or conversation. In April, a vessel was to be sent out to Norway to bring her home, and Jürgen was to go with it. He had become so joyous and hearty. Mother Brunne said that it was a pleasure to look at him. "And so it is to look at you," said the old merchant. "Jürgen has put new life in our winter evenings, and in Mother too. Why, you have grown younger this year. You were once the prettiest girl in Viborg, and that's saying a lot, for I've always considered the girls of Viborg to be the prettiest." Jürgen said nothing in reply, but he couldn't help thinking of one Skagen girl, the one he was to bring home. One morning, Merchant Bruna went out to the lighthouse, which stands quite some distance from Old Skagen, but not far from Grennen. The signal lights had been extinguished for quite some time, for the sun was already high when he climbed the tower. 4 miles from the extreme point of land, the sand reefs stretched under water. Many ships could be seen that day, and among them, with the help of his telescope, he believed he could distinguish the Karen Bruna. That was the name of his vessel. Yes, there she was, sailing home with Clara and Jürgen on board. Clara sat on the deck and saw the sand dunes slowly appear in the distance. If the wind held, they would be home in an hour. So near were they to home and its happiness, so near to death and its terrors. Suddenly a plank gave way in the ship, and the water poured in. They tried to plug the leak. The pumps worked furiously. The sails came down, and the distress flag was hoisted. They were still 4 miles out at sea, and the fishing boats that they could see were too far off. The wind carried them landward. The tide was in their favor, but they were not strong enough. When the ship began to sink, Jürgen threw his right arm about Clara. What a look she gave him as, crying on the holy name of our Lord, he leapt with her into the ocean. She shrieked in terror, but she knew he would never let go his hold. On the prow, in colors rare, the king's son clasped his maiden fair. Jürgen acted out the old words in this moment of terror and peril. How fortunate that he was an excellent swimmer. He made his way with his feet and one free hand, the other clasped tightly around the girl. Now he floated. Now he trod water with his feet, using every trick he knew to husband his strength so that it might last till he reached shore. When he heard the girl sigh and felt a shuddering thrill pass through her body, he only held her closer. Now a wave rolled over them, but the current still carried them on. The water was so deep and clear that for a moment he fancied he saw shoals of mackerel flashing beneath them. Or was it Leviathan, waiting to devour them? Shadows of the clouds swept over the water, to be followed by dazzling sunshine. Flocks of birds flew screaming overhead, while wild ducks, heavily and sleepily drifting on the surface of the water, started into the air in panic at the sight of the swimmer. Jürgen felt his strength going fast when he was only a few cables' lengths from shore. But help was coming. A boat was drawing near. Just then, he distinctly saw a white figure in the water. A wave lifted him up. The figure came nearer. He felt a stunning shock, and everything became dark around him. There on the sand reef lay the wreck of a ship with the sea partly covering it. The white figurehead leaned against an anchor, and only the sharp iron edge projected above the water. Driven on by the fatal force of the current, Jürgen had struck against this figurehead. In a daze, he sank with his burden, but the next wave lifted him and the young girl. The fisherman got them both into his boat. Blood was streaming over Jürgen's face, and he looked as if he were dead. But he still held the girl so tightly, they had to tear her from his arm. They placed Clara, pale and lifeless, in the boat and rowed toward Grennen. All methods of restoring her were tried, but in vain. She was dead. For some time, Jürgen must have been carrying a corpse, struggling and wrestling for the life of one who was already dead. Jürgen still breathed, and they carried him to the nearest cottage in the sand dunes. A sort of army surgeon, he was also a smith and a trader, who happened to be on the spot, bound up his wound, and the next day a physician was sent for from Jüring. But his brain was affected. He lay raving and uttering wild cries until the 3rd day, when he fell into a sort of trance. It seemed his life hung by a thread, and for this thread to give way, the doctor said, was the best wish they could have for him. Let us pray for our Lord to take him. He will never be a man again. But life did not leave him. The thread did not break, though memory and all other faculties of the mind were injured. It was horrible. Only a living body was left, a body that soon regained health and strength. Jürgen remained in Merchant Brunner's home. He lost his mind trying to save our child, said the old man. He is now our son. Crazy. That was what they called Jürgen now, but it was hardly the right word. He was like a musical instrument with loosened strings that have lost the power of sound. Very rarely, and only for a few moments, would the old power seem to return. Then they would give old melodies, or a few chords would be played. Sometimes pictures of the past would seem to rise before his mind, but then they would fade away into the mist, and once more he would sit with a blank, motionless, thoughtless face. We can only hope that he did not suffer. His dark eyes had lost their brightness and looked like black, clouded glass. Poor crazy Jürgen, people said, and this was he who before he was born was destined to have such a rich, earthly fortune and such happiness that it would be arrogance, terrible vanity, even to wish for or believe in an afterlife. Were all the fine qualities of his soul wasted? Only cruel days, anguish, and broken hopes had been his lot. He was like a precious root which is torn from its rich soil and flung out to rot in the sand. Could this really be the destiny of a soul created in the image of God? A mere game, battered by the chances of this world? No. The God of love will compensate him in another life for all that he lost and suffered in this. The Lord is loving unto every man, and his mercy is over all his works. The pious old wife of Merchant Brunner repeated these words from the Psalms of David in faith and comfort, and she prayed that our Lord would soon end Jürgen's life of sorrow and take him to enjoy God's gift of grace, the life everlasting. Clara lay buried in the churchyard, where the sand drifted over the walls, but Jürgen did not seem to know this. It never penetrated the narrow world of his thoughts, which lived only in fragments from the past. Every Sunday he accompanied the family to church and sat quietly with a blank face. Once, during the psalm singing, he sighed deeply, and his eyes took on life. He was gazing at the altar, at the very spot where, over a year ago, he had knelt beside his dead friend. His face turned white, his lips murmured her name, and the tears rolled down his cheeks. They gently led him from the church, but he told them that he was well, and that he had no recollection of what had happened. Poor soul, tried indeed, but not rejected by our Lord. For who dares doubt that God, our Creator, is all-wise and all-loving? Our heart and our mind give us this truth, and the Bible confirms it. His mercy is over all his works. In Spain, where gilded Moorish cupolas are fanned by the warm breezes amid laurels and orange trees, and where song and castanets are heard, a childless old man, the rich merchant, sat in his beautiful palace, sadly watching a procession of pretty children passing through the street with torches and waving banners. How much of his wealth would he not give to have such children himself? He thought of his daughter and her child, who perhaps had never seen the light of this world, hence would never attain the glory of paradise. Poor child. Yes, poor child. Indeed. A child still, though past 30 years old, for Jürgen had lived thus for many years in Old Skagen. The flying sand had drifted over the graves in the churchyard up to the very walls of the church. Here, among those who had gone before them, among relatives and friends, the dead were still being buried. Merchant Brunne and his wife now rested here, under the white sand, among their children. It was early in the year, the time of storms. The sand curled up like smoke from the sand dunes. The ocean tossed huge waves. Large flocks of birds, like storm clouds, flew screaming overhead, and ship after ship was wrecked on those fatal reefs that stretched along the coast from Skagen to the Hunsby sand dunes. One afternoon, as Jürgen sat alone in his room, a sudden light broke in his mind. It was the same restless feeling that had often in his younger years driven him out over the sand dunes or the heath. "Home, home," he said. No one heard him. He left the house, and sand and pebbles whirled around him and beat into his face. He went toward the church, where the sand lay drifted up against the wall and half covered the windows. The church door was unlocked and easy to open. Jürgen went in. The wind raged and howled over the town of Skagen. Such a hurricane had not been known within the memory of man. It was awful weather. But Jürgen was sheltered within the house of God, and while black night reigned outside, within him everything grew bright, bright with the light of the immortal soul. He felt as if the heavy stone in his head had burst with a clang. He imagined that the organ was playing, but it was only the storm and the roaring of the ocean that he heard. As he sat down in one of the pews, he thought the candles were being lighted, one by one, until there was a blaze of light such as he had only seen in the land of the Spaniards. Then, all the portraits of the old councillors and burgomasters came to life. They stepped down from the walls where they had hung for so many years and seated themselves in the choir. Then the gates and doors of the church swung open, and all the dead entered, festively dressed, as was customary in the olden days. Sweet music was played as they walked in and seated themselves in the pews. The psalm singing swelled like the rolling of the ocean. Jürgen's old foster parents from the Hunsby sand dunes were there, and the good merchant Brunne and his wife, and beside them, next to Jürgen, sat their gentle, loving daughter. She gave her hand to Jürgen, and together they went up to the altar where they had knelt once before, and the pastor joined their hands and consecrated them to a life of love. Then the sound of the trumpet burst forth, marvelously like the voice of child, full of longing and expectation. It swelled into the sound of an organ, full of rich, glorious tones, blessed to hear, and yet mighty enough to burst the tombstones on the graves. The ship hanging in the choir sank downward in front of them and grew vast and splendid with silken sails and golden masts, with anchors of red gold and ropes of silken twine, like the ship in the old ballad. The bridal couple stepped on board, and all the congregation followed. There were room and enjoyment for all. Then the arches and walls of the church blossomed like the elder and the fragrant lime trees. Joyfully they waved their green branches and bowed and parted. The ship was lifted up and sailed with them through the ocean, through the air. Every candle in the church became a tiny star. The winds sang a hymn, and all joined in. In love to glory, no life shall be lost, supreme happiness forever. Hallelujah. And these were Jürgen's last words in this mortal world, for the thread that held the immortal spirit snapped. Only a lifeless corpse lay in the dark church, while the storm howled and covered it with drifting sand. The next morning was Sunday, and the pastor and congregation set out for church. The road, buried in sand, was almost impassable. When they reached the church, they found an enormous sand heap completely covering the door. Then the pastor prayed briefly and said that as God had now closed the door to this his house, they must go forth and raise him a new one elsewhere. So they sang a psalm and returned home. In vain, Jurgen was sought throughout the town of Skagen and the sand dunes. It was supposed that the rolling waves of sand had buried him beneath them, but his body was entombed in a vast sarcophagus in the very church itself. During the storm, our Lord cast earth over his coffin. The great heaps of sand lay above and around it, and they cover it to this day. The drifting sand lies piled above those mighty arches. Thorns and wild roses now twine over the church, where the visitor struggles on toward its tower, still showing above the sand. His tombstone may be seen for miles. No king ever had a more magnificent one, and no one will ever disturb the repose of the dead, for none until now has ever known his resting place. For this story was sung to me by the storm among the sand dunes. The Old Church Bell. In the quiet, pastoral heart of Württemberg, in Germany, where the roads are lined with slender acacias that sway in the wind, and the apple and pear trees bow down beneath their jeweled harvest, there lies a little town named Marbach. It rests upon the green banks of the river Neckar, whose silver waters rush swiftly by, past vineyards and ancient watchtowers, past weathered castles and sleepy villages, until at last it finds its way into the mighty Rhine. It was late in autumn. The air was cool and restless. The vine leaves hung heavy and mottled, flushed with red, deep amber, and gold. The sky wept often, and the rain fell in slow, cold curtains across the fields, while a sharp wind came moaning through the naked branches. It was not gentle weather for the poor. The days shortened swiftly, and the gray of dusk lingered like sorrow over the land. Within the little houses, with their narrow windows and steep gables, the light burned faintly. One such house stood at the edge of the road, its walls warped with age, its roof crooked and uneven. To a passer-by, it would have seemed mean and humble, yet within those walls dwelt hearts rich in faith and reverence. It was there, one stormy November evening, that God's blessing came in secret. As the mother labored in pain, the great bell of the church tower began to ring, a bright, festive sound that poured through the wind and the rain like a promise. The chime filled the small dwelling with trembling joy. When, amid those jubilant notes, a son was born, prayer and thanksgiving rose together with the tolling of the bell, until it seemed as though heaven itself were singing. The newborn child opened his eyes, a spark of gold beneath the lamp's dim glow, and the father wrote in the family Bible, "On the 10th of November, 1759, God sent us a son." Later, when the priest baptized him, he added the names John Christopher Frederick. No one in Marbach, no neighbor, no friend, not even the bell that had first rejoiced for him, could have dreamed that this poor child would one day sing the song of the bell itself. The boy grew like the river by which he was born, swift, bright, and deepening with every mile. When he was still small, his parents left Marbach to live in another town. Yet their hearts clung to their old home, and on fair days the mother would take her son to visit it again. He was then 6 years old, a quiet child with clear blue eyes and hair the color of wheat in sunlight. He could already recite psalms and Bible tales. and in the evenings he sat beside his father, listening to stories from Gellert's Fables or Klopstock's Messiah. His sister, 2 years older, would often weep beside him when their father read of Christ's passion, tears that burn but purify, as children's tears often do. When they returned to Marbach, the little town seemed unchanged. The crooked house, with its pointed gable, still stood. The cobbled streets whispered beneath their feet as before. But in the churchyard, new graves had grown where grass once lay. And there, close to the old wall, stood something that made the mother pause. The ancient church bell itself, now cracked and silent, resting low in the grass and nettles. Its voice, which had called to christenings and weddings, tolled for funerals, and warned of fire, had fallen still. The mother told her son how, in that very hour when the bell last sang for joy, he had come into the world. The child listened gravely. He ran his small hand over the cold bronze, bent down, and kissed it, a gesture of innocent reverence that his mother never forgot. Though the bell was broken, its music lived on, in the boy's heart. Through the long years of poverty that followed, through hunger, study, and sorrow, he carried its echo within him. The child grew tall and slender, with freckled cheeks and hair of reddish gold. His gaze was bright, curious, and far away, like one who listens to something no one else can hear. He studied hard and rose through the ranks at the military school, where order ruled like iron. There he wore stiff collars and powdered hair, and was known by the command, "March, halt, front." The days were strict and cold, yet within him the bell still rang. Its old melody murmured through his dreams, through his loneliness, and through the endless drills in the courtyard. Years passed. The bell in Marbach grew rusted, forgotten beneath moss and rain. But the bell within the young man's soul began to sound louder than ever. It sang of freedom, of truth, of man's dignity and courage. It called him to rebel against smallness and fear. When he wrote his first words, pages that trembled with passion, the rhythm of the bell guided his hand. One night, while the capital blazed with festival lights and rockets painted the sky, he wept in secret. His dreams had driven him to flee from duty, from the barracks, from his homeland. He carried nothing but hope and a few pages of a play called Fiesco. Exhausted, he hid in a poor tavern in a foreign land, where laughter rang and tankards clashed, while he, thin, feverish, and unknown, scribbled verses about liberty and love. Yet even there, in misery, the bell's echo followed him. The old bell, meanwhile, lay silent by the churchyard wall, battered by the years. The wind that swept across the graves seemed to whisper its story, the joy of birth, the music of faith, the stillness of decay. But destiny had not finished its circle. Long after the bell was sold as scrap metal, hauled away from Marbach, melted in a Bavarian foundry, and forgotten once more. Yet fate weaves its marvels quietly. For in the royal city of Bavaria, when metal was needed to cast a monument to one of Germany's greatest sons, the molten bronze of that very bell was chosen. And far away in Denmark, in a land of beech woods and burial mounds, another poor boy was born, who wore wooden shoes and carried his father's dinner through the shipyards. That boy, Bertel Thorvaldsen, became the sculptor whose hands shaped immortality. From his clay arose the bronze bust of the man whose name had once been written in a poor man's Bible, John Christopher Friedrich Schiller. When the statue was unveiled in Stuttgart, 100 years had passed since the old bell had rung for the poet's birth. The city was bright with banners, and the air trembled with the sound of bells. One, however, remained silent, the old bell itself, now transformed. Yet the sunlight shone upon its surface, gleaming on the noble brow of Schiller's image. And thus the circle closed. The bell that had once celebrated a poor child's first cry now sang forever in bronze for the immortal poet he became. Its voice had crossed from sound to spirit, from sorrow to song, and from the fleeting to the eternal. In the children's room. The house was unusually quiet that evening. Outside, carriages rolled toward the great theater in the town square, their lamps glowing through the mist. Inside, the living room flickered with the soft light of a single candle. Father and Mother, along with all the older children, had gone to see the play. Only little Anna remained, sitting by the window with her grandfather. The old man's spectacles glimmered in the candlelight, and his pipe sent thin curls of smoke upward, weaving shapes in the still air. "Now, my dear," he said suddenly, with that spark in his eye that always meant something wonderful was about to happen. "Why should we be left out of the evening's amusement? We shall have a play of our own." Anna looked around, her eyes wide. "A play? But Grandpapa, we don't have a theater, and we don't have any actors either. My old doll's head is cracked, and my new one mustn't act because she'll spoil her pretty dress." Grandfather laughed, his beard trembling. "My clever child, you can always find actors if you use what you have. A wise director never complains of his stage. Come now, let us build our theater." He began rearranging the objects on the table with solemn importance. "See here," he said, setting up a large book. "This shall be one side of the stage, another book here, and another there. Aha! The wings are ready. Now for the backdrop. That old box will serve. We'll turn it around so the bottom faces us. The stage represents a parlor, I think. A fine one, with just enough mystery for drama." Anna clapped her hands. "Oh, Grandpapa, it really looks like a room." "Of course it does," said he, pleased. "Now, let's find our actors. Let's open your toy drawer. There must be a crowd waiting for their debut. Remember, first we choose our characters, and then the story will come to life by itself. That is the secret of all theater." He rummaged through the drawer with great ceremony. "Here we have a pipehead, noble and thoughtful. He shall be the father. And here, what's this? An old glove, missing its partner, a little frayed at the fingertips. Perfect. She shall be the daughter." Anna tilted her head. "But we need more. That's only two." "Patience," said Grandfather. "Ah, here's your brother's old waistcoat. Just look at it. So proud, so empty in the pockets. Yes, yes, this will do splendidly. He shall be the lover, poor and honest. The course of love never runs smooth, and his empty pockets will prove it." Anna giggled. "And what about this boot?" Grandfather's eyes twinkled. "Aha, a rival suitor, of course. Look, he even has spurs. Potts, Blitz, mazurka. He struts like a colonel and creaks like an old soldier. The lady will not love him, but he will stomp and clank until the furniture shakes." Now the cast was ready. Father Pipehead, Miss Glove, Mr. Waistcoat, and Mr. Boot. "What kind of play shall we have, my dear? A tragedy? Or perhaps a domestic drama?" "A domestic drama," cried Anna. "That's what Mama likes." "Excellent choice," said Grandfather. "Now I shall shake my imaginary bag, Kugelrum, and a brand new story shall fall out. Behold, a world premiere." He pretended to open a newspaper and began to read with great dignity. "The Pipehead and the Good Head." a family drama. In one-act characters, Mr. Pipehead, the father, Miss Glove, the daughter, Mr. Waistcoat, the lover, Mr. Boot, the unwelcome suitor. "Now then," said Grandfather, "the curtain rises, but we have no curtain, so it rises by being absent. All the characters are on stage already. Observe." He cleared his throat and spoke in a deep, booming voice. "Chit-chat, muttering, poppycock. I am master of this house. I am my daughter's father. Mr. Boot is a fine fellow, glossy as new leather, with spurs that glitter. He shall have my daughter, for I said so." Anna clapped her hands over her mouth, trying not to laugh. "Now the lover speaks," Grandfather continued in a gentle, earnest tone. "Mr. Waistcoat says, 'I am of fine silk and pure heart. I may not jingle with spurs, but I am strong in thread and honest in stitch.' 'Ha!' cries the father, 'a waistcoat fades in the wash, but Mr. Boot is waterproof and Italian.'" Anna gasped. "They ought to speak in poetry, Grandpapa. All the best plays do." "Ah, a critic already," said the old man. "Then so they shall." He adjusted his glasses and declaimed dramatically, "Miss Glove, a glove without a mate. That is forever my fate. Ah, my seams shall tear apart, if love should stretch my heart. Mr. Waistcoat, beautiful glove, be my own. Though threadbare, my love is well sewn. You're from Spain, I am Holger the Dane. But hearts speak a single tone." At this, Mr. Boot kicked the table leg, clattered his spurs, and knocked over 2 of the books. "Ah, a scene of jealousy," said Grandfather, half laughing. "But hush, my child, the best audience is the quiet one." Then came the aria, Miss Glove singing. "I have no voice, I can only crow, yet my heart says more than I can show. Caw, caw, upon the balcony high, I'll love till threads and stitches die." "Now," whispered Grandfather, "comes the grand twist. Mr. Waistcoat unbuttons himself dramatically. He made a rustling sound with his sleeve. 'You, sir, are a pipehead, but I am a good head. Behold my cunning.' Zip, and away you go," he cried, pretending to snatch the pipehead and stuff it into his pocket. Anna shrieked with laughter. "Now listen," said Grandfather. "The lover speaks again. Aha, you are in my pocket now, dear sir. You will never escape unless you give your blessing for me to marry your daughter." Then the father sighs. "I'm dizzy. My smoke is gone. Let me out and you shall have her hand." "Is it over now?" asked Anna. "Not quite," said Grandfather solemnly. "Mr. Boot, the rival, has fainted from heartbreak. See, he lies there like a fallen knight. The lovers kneel before the father. One says, 'Father,' and the other, 'Mr. Pipehead, do as you ought. Bless your son and daughter.' And he blesses them. Then all the furniture sings in chorus. Listen. Chorus of chairs and tables. Clink and clank, 1,000 thanks. Now peace and love are here. Our play is done, our tea begun. The evening ends in cheer. And now," said Grandfather, bowing deeply, "we may applaud." They clapped together, laughing and breathless. Grandfather gathered the actors in his palms for their curtain call. The pipehead, the glove, the waistcoat, and the boot, all dignified performers now. "Wasn't that fine?" said Anna. "Finer than any real theater," said Grandfather. "For ours was free, short, and filled with love, and it passed the time most pleasantly before tea." The Goblin and the Woman. Do you know the Goblin? Ah, you know of him well enough, with his gray garb and a little red cap cocked jauntily to one side. But do you know the woman, the gardener's wife? She was a curious and learned soul, one who could quote whole stanzas from memory, and, when the mood took her, set her own thoughts down in print. She could write with ease and speak with an authority that made the neighbors pause. Only the rhymes, those little clinchings, as she called them, sometimes put a crimp in her charming labors. For all that, she had the twin gifts, the gift of speech that warmed the room, and the gift of writing that filled a drawer with small green-covered books scrawled with ink blots and trembling lines. Had Providence so willed it, she might have sat in a pulpit or been the parson's wife who corrects sermons with a smile. "The earth is beautiful in her Sunday gown," she would say aloud to herself while setting a kettle on the hob. And from that single, simple fancy, she had spun a long, long poem, a stretch of tender phrases that clothed the common earth in wonder. She loved old words and old customs. She kept her language stitched with quaint Danish threads, calling simple things by names nearly forgotten. She took pleasure in twisting modern German words into fat cakes and paste leaves, as if naming them differently might make them truer. Mr. Kisserup, the assistant schoolmaster, not that his name matters beyond that he was an honest soul with spectacles and a tendency to make a sermon out of anything, was her nephew. On one of his visits to the gardener's house, he overheard the woman's poem, and, like many who hear truth dressed prettily, he declared that it did him good. "You have soul, madam," he declared with the polite enthusiasm of a pedant who mistakes feeling for evidence. "Stuff and nonsense," the gardener snapped from the doorway. He was a plain man, all hands and work, and he believed a wife's purpose in this world was to be a useful body, to keep the porridge from burning, to mend the nets, to mind the cabbage patch. Don't be putting such notions into her head. Soul, pshaw. A wife should be a body, a good, plain, decent body. "I can take the burnt taste out of the porridge with a bit of charcoal," the woman answered, smiling as she stirred the porridge with a wooden spoon. "And I can take the burnt taste out of you with a little kiss." She stepped closer and, light as a thought, kissed him. "You pretend you think only of cabbage and potatoes, but you love the flowers too. Flowers are the soul." He grunted and went out to his patch, scolding casually. "Mind your pot." For that pot was his dominion, and he minded it as one minds a child. The kitchen settled into the hum of ordinary life, but the assistant schoolmaster remained, and the two of them, she with her small green book under her arm, he with his sermon-like habit of turning every blossom of speech into doctrine, began to talk. "Earth is beautiful," he said, and promptly made of it a homily, for that was how he breathed. One who sees a phrase turns it into a pulpit lamp. "Earth is beautiful, and it shall be subject unto you." So it was said, and so we became lords of its soil. One man rules with the mind, another with the hand. One comes into the world like an astonished exclamation, another like a faltering dash that makes men pause and wonder at his purpose. Thus, one becomes a bishop, another a poor assistant schoolmaster, and yet all is for the best. Your poem is full of feeling and geography, madam, a startling union. "You have soul, Mr. Kisserup," the woman answered, half in earnest, half in the gentle mirth of someone who has been praised into seeing more of herself. "After talking with you, one understands one's thoughts more plainly." So they spoke, and their conversation blossomed, a small and tidy bouquet of ideas set upon the kitchen table. They spoke of sunlit fields and of sorrowful skies, of old words and new cake names. They read aloud to one another, and the air in the room grew warm with the companionship of words. Yet in the very same house, in a corner where hearth smoke curls and shadows lean, somebody else was talking too, though his speech made hardly a sound. The goblin, that neighbor of corners and keeper of small mischiefs, sat crouched by the black iron pot, for it had been his strange office to mind kettles in that old house for longer than anyone could remember. He was small, in his gray coat and red cap, with quick hands and quicker temper. The only creature who minded him back was the great black pussy cat. Cream Thief, the woman had named him, for he trailed the memory of any dairy in his whiskers. The goblin had a grievance. He had discovered by the softest of chance that the learned woman did not believe in him. For one so given to old customs and superstitions, that denial was a sting. She had never set a spoonful of porridge aside for him on Christmas Eve. She, with her learned books and fancy phrases, had let the memory of generations fall like a linen cloth into the dirt. "She calls me a notion," muttered the goblin between his teeth. "A mere idea. When old women and poor wives used to pinch a little from their pots and set it for me, it was thick with cream. My ancestors drank like princes. And now, because she reads, because she writes pages and pages about soul, she denies me." His tiny hands clenched. "I say with Pop, mind the pot," he declared more loudly than he meant. For Pop's voice was the oldest counsel in his little world. The woman did not mind her pot. That being so, the goblin resolved mischief. He blew at the embers until they flamed, the kettle sang, and the porridge boiled over with a great frothing splash. "Surre-rurre-rup," he cried in a voice like a hiss of sparks. "And now I'll pick holes in Pop's socks," he promised, thinking upon the gardener who had been so ready with scolding. "I'll pull a great piece and leave the toes bare so she'll have to sit and darn. Madam Poetess, pray mend Pop's stocking." He chuckled at this thought with a little goblinish glee. The cat sneezed. He had caught a draft despite the coat of winter he kept on, and sniffed at the air. "I've opened the larder door," the goblin whispered. "There's boiled cream in there as thick as paste. If you won't have a lick, I will." "If I must take the blame and get the whipping for it," the cat answered with a lazy flick of tail, "I'll at least have my share." "First a lick, then a kick," the goblin said, and then, eager for farther sport, he announced his next scheme. He would go to the assistant schoolmaster's room and tangle his suspenders upon the mirror, dunk his socks in the water pitcher, and make the good man think the punch had gone too strong and had taken his wits. "Last night," he boasted, prancing on his toes, "I dangled my legs from the woodpile before the watchdog. He leapt and could not reach. The racket was glorious. The assistant schoolmaster woke up thrice, spectacles on his nose, and yet he saw me not." The cat, sleepy and a little deaf, advised, "Say mew when you hear the woman coming. I don't feel so well today." "You have the licking sickness," replied the goblin with mock sympathy. "Lick then, and wipe your whiskers when done, so the cream won't be shown. I'll eavesdrop a little. It suits me." So he slipped close to the parlor door, and there the door stood ajar, a slender line of light like a secret between rooms. The woman and the assistant schoolmaster were alone in the parlor. The clock ticked like a careful breath. The woman, who had suddenly decided to be confiding, produced from her drawer that light green notebook with its ink blots and began to explain her private treasures. "Mr. Kisserup," she said with a conspiratorial air, Since we are speaking of soul and its ministrations, I will show you something I have never shown a living soul, least of all a man. These are my smaller poems. Some are long, some are sorrowful. I have called them clinchings by a Danik Vinde. I am fond of old Danish words. There is much that is serious here. My mind tends toward melancholy. Here are The Sign in the Night, My Evening Red, and a thing I once called When I Got Clemenson. That is my husband. You may skip that one if you wish, though it has thought and feeling. The housewife's duties perhaps is my best. Sorrowful, like all the rest. She smiled then a little oddly and added, "Only one piece is comical. You must promise never to tell my husband or any neighbor. Read it aloud, so I may know you understand my intent." So Mr. Kisserup did as he was bid. He read, and the woman listened with narrowed, pleased eyes. And so did the little goblin, who, hid behind the half-open door, leaned forward on his heels to catch the sound of his own name. When the title, "The Little Goblin," was spoken, the small creature gave a gasp of delight. "That's about me," he whispered to himself. "She has written of me." Suddenly, slights of omission cracked open into a new warmth. All his mischiefs, the pinched chickens, the overturned porridge, the socks with holes, were forgiven in one bright sentence that placed him inside a poetic role. He no longer wished only to vex. He wished to be honored. He licked his lips with a dignity that made the cat spit a little. "I have done her wrong," he thought, turning his little face toward the light that slipped under the door. "The woman has soul and breeding. She has put me into her clinchings, and they will be printed and read. I shall not let the cat drink her cream. I shall drink it myself. 2 hands make more astonishment than one, and that will be my homage to her." The cat, old and sensible, shook himself and purred. "He's a man all right, that goblin. She is sly, she is not. A single mew about himself, and he changes his mind. The woman knows ways with a whisper." But the woman? No, she was not sly. She merely was a woman who loved words. The goblin was merely a man who loved being named. If this tale leaves you puzzled, if you cannot understand how an offended sprite can be soothed by being placed within a poem, or how a learned wife and a knavish little fellow can find a chord in the oddest of ways, then ask somebody to explain it to you. Only do not ask the goblin or the woman, for their answers will be partial. The goblin will tell you of cream and cat and socks. The woman will tell you of rhyme and sorrow and the hush of evening. Either will be honest in their way, and neither will tell you the whole.